On the afternoon of May 25th, 2017, 42-year-old Nicole Gordon was laying on her couch in her home in Atlanta, Georgia, with an ice pack on her head. She had a blinding headache, one of the worst headaches she had ever had, and she was just unable to do anything else but lay on the couch. Nicole really had no idea why she had this terrible headache. The only thing she could think of was 3 weeks earlier, she had been in a minor car accident, and one of her car windows had broken, and some of the glass had cut her face, but she didn't think that would be enough to lead to this absolutely horrific headache that had not gone away for 3 weeks. But Nicole was a very tough woman, and even though she had thought about going to the hospital over these past 3 weeks to deal with whatever was causing this headache, she had told herself that, it's got to be something minor. I just need to kind of tough it out here. And what toughing it out looked like was laying on the couch all day long, only getting up to eat and go to the bathroom, not going to work, and just sitting in the darkness with this ice pack, just hoping for this headache to go away. And so as Nicole was just laying there, she heard her back door open up. It was her boyfriend, Geronte, coming in with groceries. He came inside and he put the groceries away, and then he came into the living room where she was, and he asked how she was doing. And she told him that the headache had not gone away yet, and would he mind going into the kitchen and getting her some ibuprofen, which are pain meds, as well as some water. And so Geronte said, of course. He went in the kitchen, he got what she needed, he brought it back. She said thank you, she took the ibuprofen, and then she went back to just being totally miserable. But just a second later, Nicole and Geronte heard a knock at the front door, and Geronte, he walked over and kind of casually looked through the blinds to see if he could see who was at the front door, and he saw it was Nicole's best friend, Leisha. But instead of going to the door and opening it, Geronte turned to Nicole and said, "Hey, it's Leisha, do you want me to get the door?" And Nicole, she just kind of grunted and said, "No, please just ignore her." Even though Nicole and Leisha were very close, Nicole knew that Leisha was very high energy. She had been calling and texting basically nonstop ever since Nicole had begun getting these headaches. Leisha just wanted to help and kind of be around and be a part of her recovery. But Nicole just couldn't deal with that super high energy right now. She could barely have a conversation without her head hurting even more. And she knew that Leisha and Geronte didn't really get along too well, and so Nicole figured it would just be better for everybody if they pretended no one was home and Leisha just went on her merry way. But Leisha was very persistent and just continued knocking really loud on the front door. She began calling Nicole's phone, and so Nicole began reaching over and silencing her phone over and over again. And finally, Nicole looked over at Geronte and just said, "I don't need this. I'm going into my bedroom and I'm lying down." And so she grabbed her phone, she stood up off the couch, she could barely move, her head hurt so bad, and she walked, quietly past the front door, made her way into her bedroom, and she was about to lay down on the bed when she made the mistake of opening up her blinds just a little bit. Her room was on the front of the house as well, and she wanted to see if Leisha was still there, and when she opened those blinds, Leisha, who was outside, happened to be looking at Nicole's bedroom, and the two of them made eye contact, and Nicole's like, oh my God, she knows I'm here. And so Nicole, she just shuts the blinds, but now Leisha comes up to the window and she's yelling, "Nicole, I know you're there. Come on, let me in. I want to help you." But Nicole, she just could not deal with it, and so she laid down on her bed and just continued to totally ignore Leisha. Nicole knew that no matter how offended and upset Leisha was for this snub, she would get over it, because the two women had been friends for nearly 2 decades. 19 years earlier, they had been neighbors, and they had become friends really quickly. They had been pregnant at the same time, and they began raising their kids kind of like side by side. But in the last 5 years that Nicole and Geronte had been together, Nicole and Leisha had kind of drifted apart, because Leisha and Geronte both had very strong personalities, and they just kind of clashed. And Nicole and Geronte had this kind of on-again, off-again relationship, and every time they were broken up, Leisha would come around and be totally unfiltered with Nicole about how much she didn't like Geronte. But right now, Nicole could just not deal with Leisha, and so despite hearing her yelling for her to come outside, "Come on, I know you're in there," Nicole just rolled over on her bed with her ice pack on the side of her head, and she fell asleep. A few hours later, when Nicole woke up, Leisha was gone, as well as Geronte. He didn't stick around for very long. He often would only come over just to check in, and then he'd go off and do his own thing. And so Nicole, who still had this blinding headache, she sat up, she got out of her bed, and she was only able to walk back out into the living room, where she laid down on the couch and just went right back to sleep. Even though Nicole had had this headache for 3 weeks and it had not gotten any better, she really was convinced that taking enough ibuprofen and relaxing long enough would cause it to go away. But over the next couple of days, this headache, which was already like a 10 out of 10 on the pain scale to Nicole, somehow became like a 20 out of 10, and it got so bad that she couldn't even open her eyes. It was like horrific. And as this headache got so bad, her relationship with Geronte started to sour. Geronte didn't really believe that Nicole was actually in the amount of pain that she was in, and he kind of began acting like she was just being lazy. And this really upset Nicole because that wasn't true at all. She was just in blinding pain and couldn't do anything. Finally, in late June, so 5 weeks after Nicole's headaches had begun, and at this point, her headache had still not gone away, she was laying on the couch, like always, with the lights off, she's got the ice pack on her head, and she's just trying to get through the day when she hears the back door open, and it's Geronte. And he comes in, he slams the back door, he doesn't even say hello, and he just storms into the living room and just looks down at her with a totally disapproving look. And Nicole, she kind of looked over at him, and when she saw that look on his face, she had just had it, and she said, "You know what? We're done." And immediately Geronte got so mad, and he's like, "How dare you? I've been taking care of you for the past 5 weeks, bringing you groceries, this and that." And Nicole, she had no energy to fight with him, and so she just let him rant and rave until finally he was done, and he walked out, and she was like, thank goodness. A few days later, on June 25th, Leisha was back at Nicole's house, knocking on the door. Nicole had actually texted her to let her know that she had officially ended things with Geronte, and so feel free to come over, there's not going to be any drama with him being here. And so Leisha had come back over. She was very excited to see Nicole and kind of get over the snafu of her being ignored. And when she knocked, Nicole did go up to the door and she opened it up. And Leisha, as soon as she saw Nicole, this is like the first time she's seeing her since Nicole's headaches had really begun, she knew something was definitely wrong with Nicole. Her entire apartment is totally dark. All the windows are covered up. And Nicole is squinting out at Leisha, kind of beckoning her to come inside. And Leisha's like, "Oh my gosh, like how bad is this headache?" And Nicole could barely make a sentence, and she just said, "Oh, it's so bad, it's so bad." And so Leisha came inside, and Nicole led her through the dark apartment to the kitchen and back. And Nicole, she sat down, and Leisha sat down opposite her. And Leisha began asking Nicole questions about her headache, about Geronte, just kind of about her life. And quickly, Leisha realized that Nicole really wasn't making any sense. Her answers, even to the simplest questions like, "What did you eat today?" were in fragments and didn't really make any sense. And finally, Leisha said to Nicole, "Hey, this can't be a normal headache. This is something serious. You need to go to the hospital." And at this point, even though Nicole had been trying so hard to just kind of white knuckle her way through whatever was going on in hopes it would go away, she was starting to realize that there was something wrong here and she needed help from a doctor. And so Nicole agreed to go. And so Leisha would help Nicole up and kind of assist her out of the apartment and into Leisha's car, and Leisha would take her to the hospital. And when they got there, Leisha brought Nicole into the emergency room, and she explained to the nurses and doctors that Nicole had this terrible migraine. It started after she was in this minor car accident 5 weeks earlier. And so the doctors and nurses brought Nicole back to one of the rooms, and they began kind of treating her the way they would any other patient who had a serious headache. They asked her if she was hydrated. They asked what medication she was taking. They asked her what she was eating, how much sleep she was getting. They were just kind of going down the list of different things that could cause this headache, but nothing stood out as a red flag. Even the fact that she had been in this minor car accident and had some cuts on her face from the glass, that really wasn't enough for them to think, oh yeah, that would cause 5 weeks of a persistent migraine-like headache. They even looked at the cuts on her face to see if maybe they were infected or something, but they weren't. Basically, they had no idea what was causing this. But the doctors and nurses were very concerned because persistent, extreme pain in your head could be signs of a stroke or an aneurysm or something, both of which can be fatal. So they put Nicole through a series of imaging scans to get a look inside of her head to try to figure out what was going on. And after they finished all these scans, Nicole was brought back to her hospital room and she laid down on the bed. And even though she felt terrible still because of this headache, she at least felt like, okay, finally, these people are going to figure out what's wrong with me. They're going to give me medication. This headache's going to go away and I can get back to my normal life. But only a few minutes later, as Nicole is laying there trying to get comfortable, the door to her room suddenly burst open and a swarm of people came into the room looking very concerned. And in the middle of all these people was a guy wearing a suit, and he walked up to Nicole and he said he was a police detective, and he held up one of her scans and he pointed at it. But to understand what he was pointing at on her scan, we need to go back and look at what really happened on the day that Nicole got into that minor car accident. Back in early May of 2017, Nicole and Durante, who were still dating at this point, had just come back to Nicole's house after the two of them had been at a house party together. And Nicole was furious with Durante because at this house party, he had been openly flirting with another woman right in front of Nicole. And so Nicole, after going into her house, brought it up to Durante about how disrespectful that was. And Durante, instead of being apologetic or trying to defend himself or even lie about it, he actually just got really mad at Nicole and said, you know what, fine, I'm breaking up with you. And then he began going around her house, gathering up all of his things that he had left inside of her house. And Nicole, truthfully, was so mad that she didn't really care that he was putting on this show of taking his stuff and leaving her. And so after a few minutes of Durante angrily grabbing his stuff from inside the house, he headed outside to Nicole's car where he had some more things inside of her car. And so he went in the passenger seat, and Nicole, she just reflexively got into the driver's seat of the car just to make sure that Durante didn't take anything inside of her car that he shouldn't, or mess with her car in some way to get revenge on her. And so she's sitting there, she's watching Durante right next to her, gather up his things, and then he hops out of the car, doesn't say a word to her, and then he walked around the front of her car and got into his car, which was parked right in front of hers, facing out towards the road. He climbed into the driver's seat, shut the door, and then he didn't move. And so Nicole, she's still sitting in her car, looking at Durante, hoping that he's just going to leave now, but he wasn't. And so suddenly feeling so frustrated and mad at him for everything, she turned on her car and drove forward, not fast or anything, and bumped intentionally into the back of Durante's car, and then she backed up to where she had been. And after she did that, she stared angrily at Durante, basically being like, what? Like, I want you to leave. Like, get out of here. And Durante, he was furious. And so he threw his car in reverse and he really hit the gas and rammed into the front of Nicole's car. And in fact, he hit her car so hard that her car lurched backwards and smashed into her fence. Now, Nicole's memory only showed her this exchange. She remembered fighting with Durante, him getting his stuff, and then her bumping into him, and then him really hard smashing into her. And so when she thought about the minor accident she had gotten into, this was it. But what Nicole did not know as she was laying in the hospital bed, as this detective is holding up the scan and pointing at it, is there was actually a whole other series of events that played out after Durante backed into her. After Durante backed into Nicole and she smashed into her fence, Durante got out of his car, walked up to Nicole's car, drew a gun, and shot Nicole in the head. That's what happened. This was not a glass cut. This mark on her forehead was where the bullet went into her skull. But obviously, this did not kill Nicole. It knocked her unconscious, and Durante picked her up, put her in his car, and drove her to his mother's house, where he told his mother that, oh, Nicole was drunk and she got into a small accident and, she just needs to rest. And so Durante's mom, believing her son, put some Neosporin on Nicole's entry wound from the gunshot, put a Band-Aid over it, and kind of looked after her for the night. And then when Nicole came to, she had no idea what happened. Her memory only existed up until Durante rammed into her. She didn't remember him getting out and shooting her and all of that. And so when Durante realized that Nicole didn't know he shot her, he just went along with it and said, oh yeah, you got drunk and, we were fighting a little bit and you got into a small accident and I think the glass fell down and cut your head. That's all that happened. And Nicole believed it. It wasn't until Leisha made Nicole go to the hospital 5 weeks later and they scanned her head that they discovered a bullet lodged in her brain. And so the detective came in the room holding up the scan and he pointed to the bright spot on the scan, and that was the bullet. And the doctors and nurses, they told Nicole that we've never seen anything like this, like you should be dead. And also, because this has gone untreated for 5 weeks, your body healed around the bullet. Like we can't can't even take it out now. Your brain has formed itself around the bullet, and so it will do more damage than good if we try to pull it out. And so Nicole would go on to live her life with this bullet in her head, but she never really fully recovered. As for Durante, the police would very quickly go after him, but he would flee police and evade them for 2 years. And then finally, when they caught up to him, he was hiding in an attic, and there was this whole long standoff. But then finally, he would surrender himself, and then he would get charged with a host of crimes, many of which he was convicted of. And so ultimately, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. On the afternoon of August 2nd, 1998, a 48-year-old, 6-foot, 6-inch tall hiker named Mike Turner stopped for a moment and took his bottle out of his backpack and took a sip. Mike was standing in a cluster of trees on the side of this mountain about 11,000 feet up, inside of an area in Wyoming called the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. The Fitzpatrick Wilderness is easily one of the most visually striking places in the entire world. It's like all of the extremes of nature kind of collided together in this one place. You have these massive, 13,000 foot tall snow-covered mountain peaks, you have glaciers, and then right below them, right at the base of these huge mountains, are all these lush green fields full of tall grass and flowers and animals running around and little streams and lakes. I mean, it's absolutely picturesque. In fact, some of the pictures of this area, they look fake. They're so ridiculous. But the real reason the Fitzpatrick Wilderness was known as this unbelievably beautiful place was because really it went kind of untouched by people because it was so hard to get to. I mean, basically the only people who stepped foot in this very surreal landscape were really experienced outdoors people like Mike Turner, because it took a lot of know-how just to get to this area and to survive in this area. This is a very, very rugged place. But Mike Turner was not content just going to the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. He really wanted to experience the true nature of this area. And so what he was doing while he was out there was hiking off trail. And so he's in this totally remote place, hiking around in an area that was not even marked on a map. Now, to anybody who has not done any compass and map navigating out in the wild, this might seem totally reckless. And to a degree, it sort of is. But it's something that people totally have a knack for. I can speak from my own experience. When I was in the military, we did a lot of compass and map navigating, like in the backcountry in Alaska and also in California. And I was terrible at it, but I can tell you some of my classmates definitely had sort of like an innate skill to understand where they were in relationship to terrain features. And then if you combine that with proper training and experience, I mean, these guys got really good at just being able to navigate with a map and compass. And so Mike was one of those people that really was an excellent navigator. And so walking off trail like this in such a remote place was sort of routine for him. Now, Mike was not some full-time adventurer. This was something he did that was sort of a passion for him. His job was he was a reverend at a Christian church in Idaho, and he had been for 10 years. And Mike loved being a reverend. He loved his congregation, and his wife Diane and his 3 kids, he had 2 daughters and a son, they were all super involved in the church. I mean, it was a great thing. But at the same time, being a reverend was a lot of work, a lot of responsibility, and a lot of stress. And a way that Mike had found to kind of cope with that growing stress of being a reverend was to go out hiking. He actually found, sort of ironically, that when he was out in nature hiking, he felt closer to God than when he was inside of his church preaching. And it was because he sort of looked at the world as this grand gift from God. And imagine being in the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, looking at this unbelievable terrain. I mean, it looks like, God made this. I mean, who else could? This is so strikingly beautiful. And so with that as context, on this particular day that Mike had stopped to sip water 11,000 feet up on this mountainside, this was actually the 4th day of a 9-day pre-planned solo hike through this wilderness that Mike had been planning out for over a year. Now, even though Mike was a very skilled hiker and backpacker and survivalist, he knew doing any sort of really long solo hike came with a whole bunch of risks that only really come if you're solo hiking. The biggest risk being that if you get into trouble when you're out on a solo hike, well, you're all alone. So you better have a really good plan for what you're going to do if you get into trouble. And so Mike had come up with a great plan. He had spent that whole year mapping out this off-trail path he was going to take over these 9 days. It was a 60-mile trip through the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, and he drew out basically exactly where he expected to go on a map. And he gave that map with all the different coordinates and exactly where he'd be on each day to his wife, who also was a very enthusiastic hiker. And he told her, on the 9th day, you're going to meet me at this spot at the end of the 60 miles at noon on this 9th day right here, and I will meet you there and you can take me home. However, that plan had changed on that 4th day as Mike was sipping his water on the mountainside. And only Mike knew it because he had no way to communicate back to his friends and family. Cell phones were very primitive at the time, so he couldn't just call somebody. I mean, basically, if he deviated his plan, he was the only one who would know. Now, the reason why Mike, on the 4th day of this 9-day trip, decided to alter his course made a lot of sense. So even though Mike was technically solo hiking, he was not actually alone. With him was the family dog named Andy, who was a very good-natured black lab mix who loved going hiking. And over the course of the previous day and then into this 4th day, he and Andy had been up at elevation at about 13,000 feet, walking on some icy parts of the mountain, and Andy's paws were getting really raw from kind of walking on the jagged ice. And that day, on the 4th day, Mike had noticed Andy was whimpering and struggling to keep up when normally Andy was super energetic and running all around. And he knew that, my course that I'm supposed to be going on for the next few days is going to be going all through these mountains with all this ice. And I don't think Andy can keep up. He's not going to be able to do it. And so he had decided to side skirt the mountains to avoid the ice. And even though this path was definitely going to take him a little bit longer, it would still bring him to the same destination, to that same pickup spot where his wife and his family would be waiting for him. Now, Mike understood that by deviating his route, not only would his family not know, like they would have no idea where he was, but also this secondary route he'd be taking to save Andy's paws was going to take a little bit longer than the intended course would take. And so he knew he was not going to be there at the time he said he would. So he was not going to be there at noon on the 9th day. It was going to be maybe the 10th day or beyond. But Mike had planned for this contingency. He had brought extra supplies specifically if he had to extend his journey. And so he felt confident that even though this was a big risk, to take this path that nobody knows he's on, he felt he could do it with no problems. And so after Mike finished taking a sip of his water, he pulled a bowl from his pack that was for Andy, and he poured some water in it, and he placed it on the ground, and Andy kind of made his way over and began lapping at the water. And as he did, Mike looked down and saw Andy's tail wagging happily. And Mike felt confident, seeing how much better his dog was already doing, that this was definitely the right decision. Taking this secondary route was definitely the way to go. But as Mike waited for his dog to finish drinking, Andy suddenly stopped and then lifted his head up with his ears perked up like he had sensed something. And then before Mike could stop him, Andy just took off running into the trees and disappeared. Now, Andy was a playful dog that periodically kind of ran around on the hikes like this. But remember, Mike is out in the backcountry and he's deviated his path. He needs to be really sure of where he is. He can't afford to make mistakes here. And if Andy just goes rogue and he has to go chase after him, the opportunity to get turned around or lost, or maybe come in contact with some big predator that maybe Andy has sensed, were pretty high. And so Mike grabbed the bowl and took off running into the trees after Andy. And after going into those trees, he emerged on the other side, Mike did, and suddenly he was hit with this incredible view, kind of looking down towards this lake. And there was this huge clearing on this side of the mountain that was filled with these huge boulders, like boulders the size of small cars, and they were everywhere. Basically, the mountain, as it eroded, chunks of rock were rolling down into this clearing that was sort of at a slant down towards this lake, and it just filled the entire clearing with boulders, to the point where you really couldn't actually walk on solid ground. The only way to get from where Mike was and where Andy was, because at this point he could see his dog was making his way towards the lake. Clearly, that's what Andy had sensed, the lake, and he was going to get a drink or something. And so Mike knew to get to his dog, he would basically have to climb onto the boulders and jump from rock to rock all the way to his dog. And so Mike tried calling for Andy one more time to stop and come back, but Andy was on his own program going towards the lake. And so, resigned to the situation, Mike climbed on top of the first boulder and began jumping boulder to boulder in the direction of his dog. 1 week later, on the afternoon of August 9th, Mike's wife, Diane, along with her 3 kids and some family friends, stood at the start of a trail called the Big Sandy Trail, which was the designated meeting spot where Mike said he would meet his family at the end of this 9-day journey. And as Diane stood there at this meeting place, she kept anxiously checking her watch. Mike was late, and not just a few minutes late. He was a full 24 hours late. Mike was supposed to be there on the 8th at noon, and now it's the 9th, and he's still not here. But remember, Mike is a guy that did stuff like this fairly regularly. He was very competent out in the wild, and everybody knew when he went off on this journey that, of course, there was some variability to when he would actually arrive at the meeting place. You know, despite Mike saying, I'll be there on the 8th at noon, Diane and her friends and family all sort of felt like, well, I hope he's there at noon, but realistically, he might be, several hours or maybe even a day late, and that's okay. And so the day before, when he didn't show up at noon, people were anxious, but they were okay. Now, 24 hours later, and still Mike has not shown up, there's no trace of him, Diane and her kids and the family friends, they were starting to worry. And in fact, before Mike left on this trip, he told Diane that if for some reason he does not show up on the 9th, so 24 hours after he said he would be there, and it's past 4 o'clock on the 9th, this is the trigger point, that Diane should call the authorities and assume something is wrong and send out a search party. And so Diane is checking her watch on the 9th, and soon enough, it's 4 p.m. Mike's not here. 4:05, 4:10, 4:15, still no Mike. And even though she knew her husband said, now it's time, go get the authorities, she just couldn't bring herself to do it. She felt like it's such a huge to-do if you get a search party organized out here. I mean, that's a massive effort, super expensive. And she felt like the second she told authorities that Mike would come walking out of the wilderness with a big story to tell and a big apology for being late. And so she convinced herself that, you know what, give him one more day. I'm sure he's bound to show up. But the next day, on the 10th, when still there was no sign of Mike, that morning, Diane did go to the authorities and she reported Mike missing. And just as she expected, a massive search was launched for Mike. But you need to keep in mind here that, again, Diane and the searchers and everybody besides Mike has no idea that he has altered the path he was on. And they're going to be searching this massive expanse of wilderness that even with the best of conditions, knowing exactly where someone is on their route, I mean, it's so hard to find people out here. I mean, it's totally rugged. Things are obscured from view, from the air, from the land. There are areas you can't even get to. There's predators out there. I mean, this is a dangerous thing to be doing. And again, they don't know he's not even on that path anymore. He's deviated. And so, despite helicopters in the air, horseback teams out in force, hundreds of volunteers combing the area looking for Mike, nobody found a trace of him. And after 2 weeks went by with this huge search producing nothing, they finally had to call it off. And so, of course, Mike's family is just unbelievably devastated. They have no idea what's happened to Mike. 5 days later, so 5 days after the end of the official search, we're now at August 28th at this point. A couple of backpackers were hiking through an area in the Fitzpatrick Wilderness that was actually about 17 miles away from the last known sighting of Mike Turner. Now, that was not when he went through the trees and saw the boulders. This was around the time Mike literally began the 9-day epic journey. Somebody had seen him in one area, and so where these two backpackers are is about 17 miles away from there. And so these two backpackers, they were aware that Mike Turner was missing because there were flyers up all over the place around the outside of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness at the beginning of all the trailheads and in town and all over the place. So they were aware of this, aware that Mike was missing and his dog was missing. And as they're just sitting there taking a break, this totally emaciated, ragged-looking black lab came out of the tree line, whimpering and looking like it was on its last legs. It was Andy. And right away, these backpackers knew that's the missing dog. And so they lured the dog to them with granola bars, and Andy came up and he ate, they gave him water. And just so you know, Andy would survive and make a full recovery. And so after these backpackers have Andy in their possession, they immediately contacted authorities, who then got in touch with Mike's family and said, hey, we found Andy. And so you can imagine the absolute roller coaster of emotion Mike Turner's family is going through. Now that they hear Andy is okay, Andy's come out of the forest, they're thinking, oh my goodness, maybe Mike is okay too. Maybe Andy can lead us back to where Mike is. Mike is this totally skilled survivalist. He's got to be alive out there. And so after discovering Andy, a second search was launched using Andy as the guide dog. They basically went to that spot where the backpackers found him, and basically Andy's family and some other volunteers allowed Andy to lead them back into the wilderness, hoping it would lead them to Mike. And so as this new search began with Andy leading the way, a separate backpacker, who we will call Brian, just for the sake of the story, that's not his name, but we're going to call him Brian, he was hiking through a section of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, not near where Andy was. This is a separate area. And Brian, he was not involved in looking for Mike Turner. But he was aware that Mike was missing because, again, he had seen all the missing person flyers, he'd seen the news, and when he began his own hike into the wilderness, he had seen at the start of his own trailhead a big flyer with a picture of Mike Turner and his dog saying he was missing. So Brian's aware of Mike Turner's absence, but he's just going on his own hike into the wilderness. And after a few days of solo hiking his way into this totally rugged expanse, he eventually reaches this kind of dense cluster of trees about 11,000 feet up on the side of a mountain, and he walks through those trees, and when he emerges on the other side, out in front of him, sloping down to a lake, is this unbelievable boulder field that practically takes his breath away, but that was not the thing that really got his attention. Instead, as he's taking in these boulders and this unbelievable view of the mountains in the distance and this lake, he noticed there was a man sitting on a rock fairly far across this boulder field with his back to Brian, just staring at the lake. Now, remember, this is like the middle of nowhere, and Brian certainly was not expecting to come across any other person on this journey. And so naturally he thought, okay, I need to go up and make sure this guy is okay, or if nothing else, I want to talk to him. I mean, this is a very rare thing to come in contact with other people out here. And so Brian began walking towards this guy to see what was going on. Well, that man was the missing hiker, Mike Turner, and my goodness, did Mike Turner have a story to tell. But to understand Mike's story, we need to go back 29 days to the point when Andy the dog had taken off running from Mike and he had gone into the boulder field, and Mike had emerged through those trees and seen the boulders, he's seen his dog, and he began climbing onto that first rock to begin making his way towards his dog. So Mike, he gets up on that rock and he begins hopping from boulder to boulder to boulder. And at first it's going fine. He gets about halfway across the boulder field. He's, yelling to Andy to stay put, and he's kind of making his way. It's all good. But then he reaches this one particularly large boulder that when he jumped onto it, it was kind of unstable and it began to wobble under his feet. And so instinctively, Mike tried to leap off of the wobbly boulder onto another boulder that was right nearby. But when he jumped, he sort of undershot this second boulder and so did not land on it and stay put on it. Instead, he kind of hit the face of this second boulder and slipped down to the ground. Didn't hurt Mike. He's just now on the ground in this small space between the boulders. However, unfortunately, the wobbly boulder right behind Mike, well, it didn't just continue to wobble. It wobbled to the point where it rolled forward and literally came to a rest against the second boulder that Mike had just jumped onto and failed to land on top of. Basically, wobbly boulder impacted second boulder, sandwiching Mike between them. But critically, it did not harm Mike. This is going to take some explaining, but it'll make sense after I go through it. Wobbly boulder had what looked like almost a U-shaped cutout on the face of the wobbly boulder. Like imagine a perfectly round boulder, but there's like a divot kind of sitting on the front of it. And it just so happened that on the second boulder in front of wobbly boulder, it also had a sort of divot on the face of it, kind of looking like a U-shape. And when these two boulders collided, these 800-pound boulders, Mike happened to be standing exactly in the position where those two cutouts wrapped around him like shackles. They basically pinned his ankles together, where he could not pull his legs up and out of this totally tight space that was just big enough to hold his legs in place. It was like he was anchored to the ground. But again, Mike is unharmed. His legs aren't broken. He's not battered, nothing. He just cannot move. Now, Mike instantly would have known this is a really big issue because he can't move these 800-pound boulders. They are 800 pounds, and he's by himself, minus his dog, who can't really help him with the boulders. And so Mike immediately just jumps into, oh my goodness, I have to find a way to somehow just move these boulders. Even just a millimeter, a centimeter would be enough to free his feet. And so he pulled off his bag, and one by one, he pulled out every piece of equipment he had, including his camera tripod and his stove and whatever he had. And he did everything he could to try to pry these stupid boulders off of him, but they would not budge. And so after 2 hours of trying in vain to free himself, it dawned on Michael that he was not going to be able to free himself. The only way he was getting out of here is if somebody found him and rescued him. And so Mike, doing his best to stay calm, he pulled out his journal he had brought along for this trip in order to detail, his closeness with God and, what he was learning throughout this journey. And he began documenting what happened to him to include, why he was in this boulder field, what he was doing when he got stuck, how he wound up in these sort of granite shackles, so to speak. He also very clearly in his writing was very much putting his faith in God to get him out of here. He wrote in his journal on this first day, 2 hours into this predicament, "I am in your hands, Lord. I don't know what I may face." The idea being, I don't know what's going to happen to me, but my faith is in you. I know you will help me through this. And so after writing this initial entry, Mike turned his attention to survival. Like not trying to push the boulders off, but trying to survive amidst the boulders as long as possible. And so he pulled out his blue sleeping bag and kind of wrapped it around himself to insulate himself. He got out his stove and there was some snow in reach, and he began putting snow in his stove and melting it to create water. And he also pulled his tent flap over the top of him. I mean, he was basically setting up camp inside of these boulders. And that first night must have been absolutely horrifying. I mean, the temperatures dropped down to near freezing, even though during the day it was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But that night he's in this horrible position, just trapped with his own thoughts, just hoping and praying that, God was going to get him out of here. The next day when Mike woke up, he wrote in his journal some more, and he began detailing his biggest fears. One of them was potentially having to have his legs amputated if he got out of here. The damage of losing circulation to his legs was scary. He wrote that he had food for at least a week, but he only had 2 quarts of water, and there wasn't all that much snow around him left to melt, and he was running out of fuel, and so he was really worried about not having enough water, even though, very ironically, he was like 25, 30 feet away from a lake, which he could have drank water from, but again, he's trapped to the ground. And so on the second day, Mike actually attempted to throw his water bottle, which he connected some rope to try to get it into the lake to capture some water and pull it back to him. But when he threw it, it was just short of the water. He could not get it into the water, so he couldn't scoop any water into his bottle. And then when he tried to retrieve the bottle, as the bottle was being dragged towards him, it got wedged in some rocks. And again, he can't move, so he can't possibly fling it out of these rocks. And so he couldn't even get his water bottle back. And so by the end of that second day, Mike's tone in his journal began to change. It wasn't totally negative yet, but he began talking about how, man, I wonder what's going to happen when I run out of water. I wonder what my urine will taste like if I mix it with Crystal Light. So it was kind of like he was joking about the fact that he was going to try to make his pee taste better, but it also showed he was beginning to realize just how serious the situation was. Nobody knows where he is. He's completely off the beaten path. He has no idea if anybody even knows he's in trouble, and he's about to be out of water. The next day, so the third day of being trapped inside of these boulders, Mike would once again begin writing in his journal. And his tone seemed a bit more optimistic, despite the fact that he has not solved, this water crisis he's about to face. He's down to his literal last quart of water. But in his journal, he talked about how this whole trip he went on, this 9-day trip he had planned out, the whole point was to become closer to God. And he felt like, what? I've really done that in the past couple of days. What I wanted to achieve, having a really spiritual event here, it's happened like times 100 being trapped here. I mean, this is the closest I've ever felt to God. But you could just tell there was just an underlying sense that I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to learn from this experience. I'm not going to take stupid risks anymore. I'm going to be a better father, be a better husband, be a better reverend. I'm going to make something of myself. I'm going to improve as a result of this suffering I'm going through right now. However, over the next few days that Mike continued to be trapped in these rocks with no help coming, his optimism clearly waned. He began to write that he was angry with God. He wondered, is this a punishment for something I've done? And he also thought, maybe I failed God, and that's why I'm here. But it was just clear that Mike, who was this deeply spiritual person who absolutely believed in a higher power, how could he be in this terrible position and not be getting any sort of help from God? How could that be? But unfortunately for Mike, his situation only got worse. On about day 5 or 6, as Mike was laying wretchedly inside of this horrible camp he had built, he noticed that he had completely lost feeling in his left leg. Like completely. It was a dead leg at this point. And even though he knew by this point how bad of a situation he was in, this sparked a new, very real fear inside of Mike that he detailed in his journal. He knew his body was actually beginning to break down, and still there is no help, no divine help coming in despite all his prayers. There's no one coming to rescue him. He is all alone. In fact, Mike would write in his journal something that practically brought me to tears when I read it first, and it just said, "So lonely, more than I imagined." I just can't picture what it would be like to be trapped out there. You're not hurt, but you can't go anywhere, and you're all alone, just slowly withering away. And your family, they're somewhere out there, they have no idea, nobody knows. It's just unbelievably devastating. The mental torture this man went through is just out of this world. But it just keeps getting worse. Day 6, day 7, Mike at some point actually dropped his journal, and because he can't actually reach it anymore, he just picked up whatever objects he had and continued writing on them, like his pocket Bible, and then also there was an instruction manual for his stove, and he would write in the margins, and his writing just continued to get more and more pessimistic and sad. He began writing about how intensely he regretted his decision to take the long route. He was totally setting him up for this situation. Nobody would have known where he is. And so he's hating on himself. He's still mad at God. Why aren't you here? Aren't you seeing how badly I'm suffering? I mean, this is a guy who's basically losing his mind with regret and anguish and just pure loneliness. I mean, this is horrible. But then on the 7th and 8th day or 9th day that he was stuck in these boulders, once again, Mike's writing on his random things that he wrote on took another turn. Not only was his writing becoming more and more illegible, because he's literally dying here. I mean, his body's breaking down. He's exposed to the sun all day, and then at night it's freezing cold. He's not having any water. He's drinking his urine. He's got no food left. He can barely write. His writing begins to talk about his family and his children. At this point, Mike must have known the end is near. And so all he had was just the thoughts of his family. He began wondering, what his kid's life were going to be like in the future. Because obviously the implication here is he knows he won't be there to see it. He'll be dead. And then in some of the last entries he would make, it was obvious that really Mike had turned back to God. Now he was back to approaching God with open arms. He was no longer upset or questioning God's plan. He was just ready. He actually wrote in his journal, "Fill me with peace, Lord. May my conditions not deny my love for you." And then he wrote, "I'm ready to die, though I'm missing my family." And then in his final entry, which must have been on the 10th day of his predicament, Mike's writing was basically completely illegible at this point because he's right on death's door. And even though you can't really tell what he wrote, at the end of this final entry, it says, "Love, Dad." It was like he was saying his final goodbye to his family. Then Mike took off his wedding band and he placed it on the rock next to him because he knew once he died and decomposed, the ring would fall off his bones and be lost in the rocks below. And he clearly wanted his family to have that wedding ring, so he placed it on the rock and then he prepared to die. When Brian the hiker walked up to the sitting man he saw on this boulder, he realized almost immediately that that was Mike Turner because he had seen the missing person flyers before he came into the wilderness. And so knowing this is the guy they're looking for and knowing he couldn't move him, he covered him up and then he took Mike Turner's wallet, which contained his ID. And then as fast as he could, Brian the hiker made his way back to the beginning of the trailhead and contacted authorities. I will say it took Brian almost 3 days to contact authorities, and he was going as fast as he could, retracing his steps. So that really gives you a sense of really just how remote of an area Mike was in when he passed away. And then also it would turn out that Andy the dog, who was leading that secondary search, he wouldn't find Mike before Brian would. But once they discovered where Mike had died and they checked the direction Andy was taking his family, it was obvious that Andy was heading in that direction. He was a faithful dog going back to save his owner. He just wasn't going to get there in time. And to close the story out, making it even more tragic, on the day that Mike left his wife Diane and his 3 beautiful children to begin this 9-day trek, after he left, Diane received a bouquet of flowers in the mail that Mike had sent that he knew would arrive after he had left. And attached to this bouquet was a note. And the note was written to Diane, and it just said, "Thank you for letting me live this adventure. Know that wherever I am and whatever I'm doing, I'm thinking." On May 28, 1986, a Florida real estate agent named Marguerite Welty walked up to the front door of this little white stucco home sitting right on the edge of Lake Placid in Florida. Marguerite pulled out a key from her pocket, she unlocked the door, opened it up, and then she turned around, and standing right in front of her were her clients, this young couple named Lois and Richard Goodman, who were thinking about buying a vacation home. And so this was one of the homes they were checking out. And so Marguerite smiled at her clients and gestured for them to come inside. The house sat at the end of a quiet, shady street lined with huge trees and other small vacation homes, and a lot of these vacation homes were perfectly manicured and beautiful, but the house they were touring today was not. It was unmaintained and overgrown, the paint was chipped and fading. It just looked bad. Because the owner of this property at one time had used this house as their vacation home, but lately they had just kind of stopped coming out here, and so they really never came out to check on the property, and so it definitely had the look of an abandoned property. And now the owner didn't even know if they could fix it anymore, and so they decided they would just sell it and let somebody else deal with it. And so Marguerite led Richard and Lois into the house, and she brought them right into the carpeted living room, and the house was very musky and dark. All the windows were shut and all the blinds were drawn, and so Marguerite kind of instinctively walked over to the windows and began opening up the curtains and opening up the blinds, letting sunlight into the house. And so as this room is suddenly being lit up by the sunlight, behind her, Marguerite hears Lois and Richard start to laugh at something. And so Marguerite turned around to see what was so funny, and when she saw what Lois and Richard were laughing at, Marguerite did not think it was very funny. In fact, she thought the fact that they were laughing right now was kind of rude, especially when you considered what this couple had asked of Marguerite. They had come to Marguerite and said, hey, we want to buy a vacation home. It needs to be perfect. It needs to be on the water. It needs to have this and this and this. But we have a tiny budget. Go find us homes. And so Marguerite had really struggled to find vacation homes that were in their budget, but then she had found this diamond in the rough, this house on the coast of Lake Placid. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, it had a garage, direct access to the water, it even had a boat dock. This house was perfect. Now, of course, this house had obvious downsides, like the fact that it was clearly a fixer-upper. Anybody who bought this home would have to put a lot of work into just making it livable again. And then also, there was a distinct weird vibe about the property itself. Because the owner was never there, they had covered all the furniture inside of this home with white sheets, which kind of gave it a sort of haunted house vibe. And then also, there was virtually nothing of value inside of this home, because again, the owner was like never here. But for some reason, there was this super intense security system on the house. There was cameras everywhere, and the windows had metal bars over them. And so the aesthetic inside and outside this house was not a good one. But again, Marguerite felt like if they could just look past the negative stuff, this was really the perfect place for them. But now, here Marguerite's clients were, laughing away at the kind of goofy interior of this home. It's like they were being totally disrespectful both to Marguerite and, frankly, to the owner of this property. This is a good opportunity. What are you doing? But ultimately, Marguerite couldn't force her clients to be appreciative of this. And so she just kind of laughed along with them, but then very quickly changed the subject and told them, hey, let's go walk around the rest of the house. Make sure you see the whole place before you pass judgment. But Marguerite only had to lead Richard and Lois around the house for a couple more minutes to figure out they definitely were not in the market for this house. They could not look past the bizarre kind of spooky almost atmosphere inside the house and how run down it was. So they were just not going to put an offer on this house, and Marguerite knew it. And so even though Marguerite was definitely frustrated, she told her clients, don't worry about it. I'll go back to the drawing board. I'll find more properties and we'll check those out. And so Marguerite led Richard and Lois out of the property. She shut and locked the door behind her, and then she and her clients left. 2 days later, on May 30th, 1986, the owner of this rundown old vacation home came by to check on the property. Basically, because they were trying to sell it, they just wanted to go up and make sure there were no obviously bad things about the property. They knew it was in rough shape, but, they're just doing a sanity check. And so they get to this property, they open up the door, and they step inside, and right away, the owner is hit with this horrible smell. Now, the owner knew it normally did not smell great inside this home, but this smell he was smelling now was just so bad. It was so pungent, he knew it was not normal. And so the owner began walking around the house trying to figure out where the smell was coming from, and at some point he found himself in the living room, and his eyes happened to land on the thing that Richard and Lois Goodman had been laughing at 2 days earlier. Except when the owner saw this thing, he didn't think it was funny at all. In fact, what he did is he instantly turned around, ran out of the house, grabbed a phone, and called 911. 4 days earlier, on May 26th, A 28-year-old man named Thomas Lopez Ruiz, who was living in this makeshift campsite down by the water near Lake Placid, he decided to leave his campsite and go into town to try to earn some money. Thomas did not have a steady job. Instead, he did odd jobs in town whenever he could to earn a few bucks. But on this day, when Thomas went into town, there was no work. So Thomas decided he would go rob one of the many vacation homes along the coastline of Lake Placid. And the home that he picked is the same vacation home that Marguerite would take the Goodmans to 2 days later. And so Thomas arrives in front of this overgrown property and he tries the doors and they're all locked. However, Thomas had a plan. Thomas was a pretty small guy. He was about 5 foot 2 inches tall, only weighed about 140 pounds. And so he figured he could just slip through the chimney. That's how he could break into the house. And at first it went great. He slipped in no problem. And before long, he was making his way down towards the inside of the house. But what Thomas realized as he went down the chimney is the chimney was not perfectly straight up and down. Instead, it was sort of tapered, where at the top it was wide, but the deeper you got, so the farther down you went in the chimney, the narrower the inside of the chimney got. And so when Thomas was almost all the way down the chimney, he got stuck. He could not get the rest of the way down, but where he got stuck, he couldn't grab the top of the chimney. He couldn't pull himself out. And so he is absolutely wedged, can't go down, can't go up, and making matters even worse was every time he exhaled, his chest would shrink a little bit, and that would cause him to slip a little bit farther, a little bit deeper into the chimney, and then when he would try to breathe in again, his chest would not be able to fully expand again. And so basically, every second that went by, Thomas was sinking lower and lower and lower by little bits, making it harder and harder and harder to breathe. And you got to figure that he was screaming for help, which again was causing him to breathe a bunch, causing him to sink even farther. And so it would have made breathing extremely difficult. And so Thomas is like in this absolute claustrophobic nightmare. And without outside help, he had no chance of survival. 2 days later, Marguerite Welty brought the Goodmans into that property, and she would open up the blinds, and sunlight would come into the living room, and Marguerite would hear Lois and Richard laughing at something, and she would turn around, and she would see they were pointing at the fireplace, and visible in this fireplace were 2 legs dangling down inside the chimney. They were not so far down that they were touching the ground. They were just kind of suspended in the air. And Lois and Richard, based on the way the house looked already, the kind of spooky vibe, there's white sheets over all the furniture. There are these bars on all the windows. Everything is dark and dirty and kind of gross. Like there's this haunted house vibe to this place. And they're thinking, this must be a Halloween decoration or some sort of prank, a mannequin kind of jammed up into the chimney, maybe to look like a robber breaking into your house or something that the owner never took down, because clearly the owner stopped taking care of this property. And so it kind of makes sense that these decorations would be left out. And so Lois and Richard are laughing at this Halloween decoration. And Marguerite, she looks at the legs too and also thinks they're just some Halloween decoration, doesn't think anything of it. And so finally they end up leaving, and that was it. But as I'm sure you all have guessed, of course those legs were not mannequin legs. Those were Thomas's legs. And in fact, the creepiest part about this is Thomas may have been alive during the house tour. The autopsy showed he actually did not die of asphyxiation, so he didn't suffocate. He died from dehydration, which takes about 2 days, and this house tour was about 2 days in. And the day prior to the house tour, a neighbor had been outside and they thought they heard someone yelling inside of the property, but for some reason, the neighbor just didn't do anything about it. And so there's a pretty good chance Thomas was barely alive as they were touring the house. But, by the time the owner came back 2 days later and smelled that horrible smell, Thomas had passed away, and that smell was the smell of his body decomposing. Also, just to close the loop on this, it's not clear why the homeowner had that really aggressive security system with the bars on the windows. He just did. On the afternoon of May 11th, 2015, 55-year-old Natalia was gathering sap inside of a Russian forest with her 82-year-old friend, Valia. The two of them had been coming to this grove of birch trees for many years. They enjoyed the peace and solitude of nature, and it was also a good place for Natalia to bring her little dog so he could run around while they collected the sap. It was a perfect spring day. The weather was very mild, the sun was out, and the two friends had a great time just kind of moving around the different birch trees, using their little drills and hammers to get their taps into the tree, and then they'd put their glass bottles underneath each tap to collect their harvest. And then at some point, Natalia felt like she had all the sap she would need, and she began gathering up her things to get ready to leave. And as she did that, she looked over at Valia, and she had found this really big birch tree, and she had sat down underneath it and was working hard to set her tap. And so as Natalia registered that Valia was over here, kind of doing one more tree before they left, she began looking around for her dog. And she found her dog, and he wasn't too far away from Valia, and he was just kind of moseying around one of the trees, when suddenly Natalia noticed the dog came to a hard stop, and it turned and looked deeper into the forest, like it had clearly registered something that had put it on alert that was out of view. And so Natalia, her view was obscured from whatever the dog was looking at, and so she put down her equipment and kind of moved between the trees to see what her dog was looking at. And at some point, her view cleared, and she saw pretty far off in the forest was something huge, this dark thing kind of moving behind the trees. And suddenly, it jumped out from behind the trees and ran towards the dog. It was a huge Russian brown bear. And so totally horrified, Natalia's watching this bear charge her dog. She looks over, she sees Valia, who's pretty hard of hearing, is sitting with her back to this bear and the dog, still just working on this tree. And Natalia's just frozen for a moment, having no idea what to do. And then instinct suddenly took over, and Natalia just turned and began running away, leaving Valia and leaving the dog. But after only running several paces, she stopped and turned around and saw the bear is still trying to attack the dog, but the dog is standing its ground and barking at the bear, which is kind of causing it to back up and be a little unsure of itself, even though this dog is so much smaller. And still Valia is not reacting at all. She has not heard the bear, the dog, nothing. And Natalia, she's looking back knowing that she needs to do something. She can't just let her friend and her dog get killed. And so Natalia began walking slowly back in the direction of this bear, and she began screaming at Valia to get up and run with her. But the second Natalia began screaming, the bear went from looking at the dog to turning and looking at Natalia, and suddenly it was like the dog meant nothing. The bear had decided it was going to go after Natalia. And so Natalia, she's staring at this bear, realizing, oh my God, it's going to charge me. But before she could even turn to run, the bear had ran at full speed and jumped at her. Natalia turned and she tried to run, but the bear bit down on her thigh, and she felt it crush her leg and pull her to the ground and whip her up against a nearby birch tree. And she's screaming and trying to pull herself away, but the bear is ripping at her leg, trying to yank her back into the forest. And then Natalia, she sees her little drill that she uses to set the tap in the trees, and she reaches out and she grabs it, and she turns, and her leg is being actively eaten by this bear. And she turns on the drill, and she's about to jam it into the bear's eye when the bear suddenly stands up to its full height and then just falls all its weight down onto Natalia's chest. And immediately Natalia dropped the drill, and the bear clenched down on her throat. Now, at this point, Valia, who again is hard of hearing, she didn't know what was going on, she turned around and saw this bear mauling her friend. And so what does she do? She runs over to this bear, right behind it, and begins pummeling this bear and screaming at it to get off her friend. And the bear, who barely registers Valia hitting it, it just lets go of Natalia for a second, it turns around, and you gotta remember, this bear has been eating Natalia. Its face is covered in her blood, and it turns and looks at Valia, and Valia, she's terrified, she begins stumbling backwards, and the bear is clearly about to jump on Valia when Natalia, who's barely alive, she sees this happening, and she just begins screaming at this bear while she's laying there bleeding out, trying to attract the bear to come back and keep eating her to spare Valia. And it works. The bear, hearing Natalia screaming behind it, forgets about Valia and turns back around and resumes eating Natalia. And then just seconds later, the bear actually lifted up Natalia by her neck and it ran off into the woods carrying her. And so Valia is just left watching this happen. She knows she's not going to be able to stop this bear. And so she just begins running back towards the car, which was not that far from where they were. And when she got out there, she grabbed her phone and she called the authorities. About an hour and a half later, hunters sent by the police, along with animal control, arrived at this parking lot and they found Valia, who was totally in shock, and she would tell the hunters and animal control where this birch tree grove was, where all this happened, and a moment later, the authorities headed into the woods. And after arriving at the birch tree grove, they actually saw the bear. It was by itself, and it turned and looked at them, and it began charging them, and they all raised their rifles, and they fired at the bear. And they shot it enough times that the bear collapsed right in front of them, and then they shot it one more time to make sure the bear was dead. But there was no sign of Natalia anywhere. But then suddenly, the authorities turned and saw something move off in the distance, and out from behind a tree came Natalia's little dog. It had somehow not sustained any injuries from this bear, even though the bear had originally gone after the dog. And the dog, it came up to the authorities and then quickly doubled back behind a tree. And so kind of operating on instinct, the group followed the dog around the tree, and they saw the dog was closely guarding this kind of mound that was covered in sticks and leaves and dirt. And so one of the hunters walked over and looked down, and they realized there was a person underneath this mound. It was Natalia. They pulled off all of the dirt and the twigs, and they found her absolutely destroyed, mauled body. But Natalia was actually still alive. Brown bears are notorious for eating their prey while they are still alive. And in many cases, they will gravely wound their prey, but not let it die, because then the meat is fresher when they come back and eat it later. And so bears will wound their prey and then basically bury them, cover them up with sticks and dirt, kind of like putting it in the fridge, and then come back and eat them later on. And so Natalia was earmarked to be eaten later because she was still alive and buried. Natalia was rushed out of the forest to a nearby hospital, and she would stay there for several weeks because she had serious injuries from this bear. All over her body were these huge bite marks, and a lot of the flesh from her leg had been pulled off. But amazingly, she would recover, although the trauma of nearly being eaten by a bear has never left her. On the morning of September 19th, 2013, a man named Mark Casey sat with his girlfriend, Lynn Spalding, in the triage area of the emergency room at San Francisco General Hospital. A nurse took Lynn's temperature and her blood pressure, while Mark tried to explain what had been going on with Lynn over the past few weeks. Lynn, who was now 57, had been dealing with this really intense stomach pain. And so she had gone to the doctor, and she had been diagnosed with a urinary tract infection, and she was given antibiotics for it. But despite taking those antibiotics, it didn't get rid of the stomach pain. And in fact, her stomach pain was only getting worse. She was losing weight, and she just seemed really frail. But despite her condition obviously getting worse every single day, over the past few weeks, Lynn had basically refused to go back to the hospital, despite Mark saying, "We really gotta go. You're getting worse. We gotta have you looked at." But she just kept saying no. And then finally, when Mark noticed Lynn was now becoming somewhat despondent, like he would try to talk to her and her eyes would glaze over and she would look off into the distance like she didn't even hear him, Mark had just looked at Lynn and said, "You know what? I'm taking you to the hospital." And so he put her in the car, he brought her to the hospital, and now that he was here, he had to explain what was going on because Lynn was still despondent, just kind of staring off into space and very likely having no idea what was going on. And so after Mark gave all the information to the nurse said that, okay, Lynn needs to be admitted to the hospital. And so after a short wait, an orderly came over and pushed Lynn's wheelchair up to the 5th floor where she'd be staying, and Mark went with them. And then once in the room, Mark helped Lynn get settled in her bed. And again, Lynn is just kind of staring off into space, not really paying attention. And then a whole team of nurses and doctors came in and hooked Lynn up to IVs and different machines to make sure they could monitor her. And then at some point, one of the doctors pulled Mark aside and said, we think Lynn is dealing with some kind of infection. And so what we need to do is run some tests to figure out what this infection is. And then hopefully we can treat it. And so Mark said, okay, that sounds great. And then all day, Mark sat right next to Lynn and held her hand as the medical team came in and out of the room running all these tests. The following day, the medical team still didn't know what was wrong with Lynn. The tests they had run so far were inconclusive or were negative. Now, the biggest issue with Lynn was not trying to figure out what infection she had or how to cure her. Instead, it was, how do we keep Lynn in her hospital room? Because on this second day that Lynn was at the hospital, despite being very despondent still, any chance she got, she was getting out of her bed and trying to escape her room. And so the medical team, they kept having to go find her and bring her back to her room. And they tried to explain to her, like, Lynn, you're sick. That's why you're here. You need to stay in your room. But Lynn clearly was just not getting it. She was just not there. And she would just say to the team, I want to go home. I just want to go home. I want to go home. And they would say, well, Lynn, you got to get better first, and then you can go home. Now, Mark, like the medical staff, was also concerned about Lynn's behavior. It was not safe for her to get up and flee her hospital room. But Mark kind of secretly thought, maybe this is a good sign, because the day before, Lynn couldn't even walk on her own. And now today, she's walking around on her own, trying to escape the hospital, which is bad. But, she's ambulatory. That's going to be a good sign. And also, Mark was thinking that because Lynn was fleeing her room over and over again, she's going to get even better medical care because the staff has to be super focused on her. And so Mark was feeling kind of optimistic that Lynn was on the road to recovery. The next morning, so now Lynn has been at the hospital for 2 days at this point, a nurse went into Lynn's room to check on her at about 10:15 a.m., and she walked up to Lynn, who was in her bed, and Lynn immediately told the nurse that she wanted to go home, and the nurse said, sorry, Lynn, we still don't know what's wrong with you. You got to stay here for now. But again, it was pretty clear Lynn did not understand what the nurse was saying. And so Lynn was not agitated. She was laying in bed and did not appear to, want to flee the room anytime soon. And so the nurse took Lynn's vitals. They were all basically normal. And then the nurse wrote down on Lynn's chart that her condition as of this moment was fair. And then the nurse left the room. And once this nurse was gone, Lynn laid in bed for a second. And then when nobody else came in the room, she sat up, she hopped off the bed, and she took off her hospital gown. She pulled out all the cords and wires that were on her. Then she put on her jeans, her boots, her jacket. She grabbed her purse off the table, and she walked out the door. And the second she walked out the door, she would have been in this long hallway, except her room was at the end of the hallway. So when she stepped out into that hallway, if she turned right, she would have seen a long, long stretch of hallway with other hospital rooms and lots of staff and doctors and nurses kind of walking around. But to her left, it would have been a dead end with a single blue door with a green exit sign over the top of it. And so Lynn, she steps into the hallway, she looks down the long side to the right, then she looks to the left, she sees the blue door, and she goes to the blue door, she opens it up, and she disappears inside. When the nurse came back to Lynn's room and saw she wasn't there, she reported Lynn missing. Now, remember, the hospital was well aware of the fact that Lynn had been trying to escape for the past 48 hours, and so nobody was really shocked by this. In fact, the hospital, their first move was to contact Mark, who had actually gone home the night before to get some real sleep and to take a shower. And so they contacted Mark and they said, hey, Lynn's not here. Is she with you? And Mark was like, no, I'm home. She's not here. I have not seen her. I haven't talked to her. I have no idea where she is. And so the hospital at this point began this huge search in their building, just checking the entire property for Lynn, but there was no trace of her. And so the police were contacted and they launched a search both of the hospital grounds and also of the surrounding areas. And they too could not find a trace of Lynn. It was like Lynn just vanished into thin air. That is until October 8th, 2013, so 17 days after Lynn had strolled through that blue exit door. On that day, October 8th, a hospital maintenance worker was walking down the long hallway in the hospital, not on the 5th floor where Lynn was staying, but one floor below, so on the 4th floor. And he's walking down this long hallway in the direction of the dead end side, so the same side that Lynn was on where her room was, but again, one floor above. And the maintenance worker, he walks all the way to the end of this hallway on the 4th floor, and he arrives in front of the blue door with the green exit sign above it. Again, this is below where Lynn was, but it looks the same. And the maintenance worker, he opened up the door, and when he looked out of the 4th floor door, he just froze because what he was looking at just seemed impossible. And then he had this urge to scream, but he knew there were all these patients and kids and doctors and stuff in the hallway behind him, and he didn't want to scare anyone. And so very quietly, he reached down and grabbed his radio, and he called for help. In order to explain what happened next, you need to look at this picture. So in this picture, on the right-hand side, you see there are 2 outdoor landings with people on them. The one on top is the 5th floor landing, and the one below it, with a single person on it, is the 4th floor landing. And to get onto these outdoor landings, you have to walk through those blue exit doors at the end of those hallways. These blue doors are emergency exits. And so when you go out these blue doors, once they shut, they lock automatically. But now you're out on this outdoor landing, and immediately to your right, although you can't see it in this picture, there is actually another door that leads to this enclosed stairwell that will bring you all the way to the ground floor, where there's another door that's unlocked that will bring you out to safety. And so again, you walk out one of those blue doors, you're on this landing, you can turn, open up another door, you're in the stairwell, and you can evacuate. So, in theory, if you were a person that really wanted to escape this hospital, like Lynn did, going out one of these blue door emergency exits was a great idea. It would bring you to the ground. This is a way to escape the hospital. But remember, Lynn was totally confused. Mentally, she was just not there because of whatever illness was affecting her. And so when she walked out that door, she arrived on the 5th floor landing, and the door shut behind her and it locked. And the theory is, as soon as Lynn got out there, maybe she had some second thoughts and wanted to go back into the hospital. And so she turned and she grabbed that door and tried to open it back up again, but because it locks automatically, it wouldn't open. And so Lynn did have the wherewithal to turn and see this other door that led to this enclosed stairwell, the emergency stairwell that did go to the ground floor. She could absolutely go all the way down and escape. She could do that. She went into the stairwell and she went down 1 floor to the 4th floor landing. And when she got there, she left the stairwell and she went to that door that would lead back into the hospital on the 4th floor. And she tried it, but of course it was locked. And then again, instead of her just going back into the stairwell and going down and escaping to safety, she, for some reason, just stayed on the 4th floor landing. Again, you got to remember that she's not all there mentally, and so she was confused, and she just stayed there on the landing, basically waiting to be rescued. But despite these huge searches of the hospital property by hospital staff and by the police, for some reason, this area, this landing on the 4th floor, was never checked. And so nobody found her. That is until October 4th. So at this point, Lynn has been outside for 13 days on this landing, and a researcher from the hospital, for whatever reason, exited out one of these emergency doors, and they began making their way downstairs. And when they passed by the 4th floor landing, they spotted Lynn on the ground on the 4th floor landing. But instead of going over to her and seeing if she was okay, this researcher just called security and said, hey, there's a patient outside on the 4th floor landing, like, come check it out. And then instead of waiting for security, the researcher just left, leaving Lynn alone. And security at the hospital, who said they were going to go check, they didn't. And so 4 more days would go by with still nobody officially finding Lynn. And then finally, on October 8th, the hospital maintenance worker opened up the blue door on the 4th floor, and he saw the 4th floor landing, that exterior landing, and he saw Lynn, and he knew she was dead. Officials were never able to determine when Lynn died, so it's not clear how long she was alive out on that landing. But it is possible she could have been alive when that researcher found her, but obviously help didn't come in time. Ultimately, Lynn's family would sue the city and the hospital, and they would be awarded $3 million. Carlos Camejo woke up freezing cold and totally confused. It was September 6th, 2007, and all Carlos could remember was being on his motorcycle with the hot sun bearing down on him as he wound his way on his bike through the streets of La Victoria, which is a city in Venezuela. Carlos tried to open his eyes, but he couldn't, and then when he tried to move his body, he couldn't do that either. And so he began to panic because he's paralyzed, but he told himself to calm down. If he couldn't move, at least he could think. He could try to process, what's going on here. There has to be an explanation for it. it. And so Carlos, in total darkness and immobile, began going through over and over again this whole motorcycle trip, which was his last memory. And he remembered that his friend had called him up and asked him to go out on this ride. Carlos used to go out all the time on his bike for fun with his friends and by himself, but now that he was 33 years old and married, he didn't have the time for it as much. But the weather had been so beautiful that when his friend had called and asked to go out, Carlos said, let's do it. And so Carlos began going over in his head the route that they had taken through La Victoria, and all he could remember was this long straightaway and then a right turn and then nothing. It was like after he made that turn, everything went blank. And as Carlos thought about how weird it was that one, he was paralyzed, and two, he had no memory of what happened after he made that right turn, he started to realize that he felt something against his back. It was like there was a block underneath his back, kind of right between his shoulder blades, propping his chest up, and he felt his arms kind of dangling down by the side, and it was very uncomfortable. And as he laid in this totally awkward position, he began to hear somewhere out in the ether, unfamiliar voices just kind of chatting. And immediately, Carlos is like, okay, someone's here to help me. I don't know what's wrong with me, but somebody's here. I'm going to be okay. And soon, whoever was talking near Carlos had moved closer to him. And actually, Carlos began to realize that it was actually more than one person. It was at least two people talking back and forth. But again, Carlos can't open his eyes. He can't move. He can't communicate with these people. He just knows they've come closer to him. And after these people had moved right up against Carlos suddenly felt something metal pressing up against his chin. And it was kind of sharp and it kind of hurt when it touched his chin. And Carlos wanted to scream out and tell them whatever they were doing to stop and at least tell him what was going on. But Carlos couldn't make a sound. And then Carlos began to hear this kind of mechanical whirring sound, like a machine starting up that was very close to where he was. And suddenly Carlos began panicking, like, what's going on? What are they doing to me? And as Carlos's heart rate is starting to speed up, one of the people who had moved near Carlos suddenly said, oh my God, that's impossible. This can't be. And then again, Carlos felt more pain in his chin. And then the pain got dramatically worse. It went from just kind of like a poking feeling to something going into his chin, and he felt it moving underneath his skin like a knife cutting through him. And then whatever it went out of his chin. And as this is happening, Carlos is trying so hard to just wake himself up and do something to tell these people to stop, but he just couldn't do it. And then again, he felt that sharp pain in his chin, another round of something going into him, moving underneath his skin and then poking out again. And the pain became so blinding that suddenly Carlos was able to kind of break through this paralysis and his eyes shot open. And for a second, all Carlos could see was like blinding lights. But then as things came into focus, he saw there were two people, the people who had been speaking, wearing these huge goggles and face masks. And one of them was holding a big needle with black thread attached to it. And that thread was coming from Carlos's chin. They had been running that needle through his face, stitching his chin for some reason, but with no anesthetic. And so as Carlos is staring up at these people in goggles, the people in goggles are looking down at Carlos and they're totally horrified. And they just kind of begin backing up, not really sure what to make of this. And then Carlos, again, kind of breaking through this weird paralysis he was under, he was able to lift his head up and look down at his body. And he saw, to his horror, that he was totally nude. He was laying on a metal table, and there was this Y drawn on his chest, starting at his collarbones, coming down right underneath his throat, and then straight down across his chest. And then after Carlos saw this Y on his naked body, he looked over at a tray that was right next to this metal table near these two guys in goggles who were now kind of backing up, and he saw there was a whirring instrument on this table, and it was a circular blade, a saw. That was the sound he heard. And that's when Carlos figured it out. Earlier that day, when Carlos had been out riding his motorcycle with his friend, he had gone down that long straightaway in La Victoria, he had made a right turn, and parked illegally right after this turn was this big truck. Carlos didn't see it, and at full speed, he impacted the truck, he was thrown from his bike, smashed into the ground, horrific injuries, and when paramedics showed up, they pronounced him dead on the scene. And so he was moved from the scene of the accident to the morgue. And at the morgue, Carlos was stripped naked and put on this metal table, and they placed a block underneath his shoulders, kind of propping his chest up, and they drew a Y down the center of his chest for his autopsy. The two doctors that Carlos ultimately saw chatting and performing this autopsy were going to follow that Y on his body with the circular saw. That's how they cut you open during an autopsy. But right before they were about to do that, the doctors noticed that Carlos was actively bleeding from his chin. And since he was supposed to be dead, that didn't make any sense. And so that was why one of the doctors had said, "Oh my goodness, this can't be." And so not really sure what to make of it, they had just grabbed a needle and begun stitching his face together to stop the blood from going down his chest. And then Carlos opened his eyes, and it dawned on the two doctors that, oh, he's alive. That's why he's still bleeding. We should definitely take care of him now. But amazingly, after Carlos came back from the dead, he was simply moved into the hallway and left on this metal table, and the doctors who were going to perform his autopsy just left the paper that said he needed an autopsy in his pocket, just kind of showing that, hey, we were just following orders. Somebody told us to give you an autopsy. This is not our fault. And that's where Carlos stayed until his wife showed up and found him in the hallway, just laying there as if he was still just waiting for his autopsy. Carlos would suffer horrible injuries from the accident and serious emotional trauma from almost being cut open during this autopsy, but he would make a full recovery. On the evening of March 22nd, 1994, a 40-year-old, very experienced airline pilot named Andrei Danilov walked into the cockpit of a huge airplane that he was about to fly out of Moscow. Once he was in the cockpit, he said hello to the two other pilots he'd be flying with that night, and then Andrei took a seat in the captain's chair. Now, this flight tonight was going to be a very routine 13-hour trip to Hong Kong, something Andrei and these other two pilots had done many times before. But this night, Andrei was totally dreading this trip because one of the pilots he'd be flying with that night was a guy that Andrei just could not stand. His name was Yaroslav Kudrinsky, and he was going to be the relief pilot that night. So Andrei is the captain and the primary pilot. He has a co-pilot or first officer who sits right next to him. And then behind those two would be Yaroslav, the relief pilot, who basically is just there in case the captain or first officer needed a break. And so basically, Andrei was going to be forced to interact with Yaroslav all night long. And so as passengers made their way onto the plane, and as Andrei went through his pre-check procedures to get ready for this flight, Yaroslav just started yapping away about how amazing he was and what a great dad he was because he brought his kids on this flight. You know, they hadn't done a big international flight before, and so he was letting them fly with him that night. And then also Yaroslav began talking about this big surprise he had for his kids that was really going to show what an incredible father he really was. Now, Andrei and the first officer were listening to Yaroslav, but they were basically just completely ignoring him. They're not responding to him. They're not feeding into what he's saying. But Yaroslav didn't care. He just kept on rambling on and on and on about how amazing he was. And so finally, Andrei got clearance to take off. And so even though Yaroslav was totally annoying him, he was able to take off, and they went up to their cruising altitude, and they began making their way towards Hong Kong. And the whole time, Yaroslav's just going on and on and on. And finally, 5 hours into this trip, Yaroslav is still just going on and on and on. And Andrei has just had it. He cannot stand to be around this guy anymore. And so finally, Andrei turned around and just cut off Yaroslav, who was mid-sentence about some anecdote about how strong his son was and what a talented wrestler he was. And so Andrei just cuts him off and is like, Yaroslav, take over. I'm taking a break. I'm going to go sleep for a bit. And so Yaroslav would stop what he was doing. He would stand up. He would take his seat in the captain's chair, and he would take over flying the plane. And so Andrei got up. He left the cockpit. He went to the very back of the plane in the main cabin to this row of seats that was reserved for him and the other pilots. And he got in there and he laid down and he closed his eyes. But just a couple of minutes after closing his eyes, Andrei began to feel the plane begin to bank hard to one side. Now, Andrei couldn't really remember if this was the time they were supposed to be turning or not, but it just felt like this turn was more aggressive than anything he anticipated at any point in this journey. But Andrei knew this plane was brand new, and so if there were any kind of minor mistakes that Yaroslav was making flying the plane, well, the autopilot feature, which was state-of-the-art in this plane, would easily correct those small errors and keep the plane going towards its destination. And so, even though, again, they're still in this pretty sharp turn here, Andrei just closed his eyes again and tried to go to sleep. But a couple of minutes later, they were still banking, and in fact, the bank was starting to get even more aggressive, to the point where Andrei opened his eyes and he's thinking to himself, what is Yaroslav doing up there? Like, we're basically going in a circle at this point. We're spiraling midair. And so right as Andrei was about to get up and go see what the heck was going on, the plane began to shake really violently, and suddenly Andrei realized, oh my goodness, the plane could be stalling right now. There could be a real issue in the cockpit, and this is not some minor error. And so as passengers on the plane are starting to sense that something could be wrong here, I mean, the plane is like hard to the side and shaking, so people are starting to scream and cry, people are nervous. And so Andrei, he begins to stand up to go to the cockpit when suddenly the plane goes from just shaking and banking to basically rolling completely on its side. So all the windows are now on the ground and everybody's on their side. Andrei knew he could not go to the cockpit. There was no way to do that. And so all he could do was just hold on to his seat and pray they got out of this. And then just as quickly as all this started, it stopped. The plane kind of went back to level, it stopped shaking, and then Andrei heard the sound of the twin engines out on the wings roar as if the plane was kind of getting back up to speed, and for a second, it seemed like everything was okay. And so Andrei, sensing that this was his chance to get back to the cockpit and frankly just reassume command, because whatever was going on in there, it was not okay. And so Andrei, he got up and began running down the aisle to get to the cockpit. But right as he was about to grab the door, the plane suddenly tilted upward and they began rocketing up into the sky, so strong that Andrei was pinned to the carpet. And so for a couple of seconds, Andrei couldn't do anything, but then he began to hear the sound of the actual frame of the plane beginning to crack from all the pressure of accelerating so quickly up into the sky. And so with all of his strength, Andrei reached up, he's on his hands and knees, and he grabs the door handle to the cockpit and he opens it up, and the second he looks into the cockpit, he would have known exactly what was wrong. It would turn out Yaroslav's big surprise for his kids that he promised Andrei and the first officer would demonstrate what an amazing father he was that he was going to let his kids fly the plane. Just for a second, but these are untrained children that have no idea how to fly a plane. And so when Andrei got up and went to go take a nap and Yaroslav took over, well, Yaroslav called up his kids who were in the main cabin, a teenage son and daughter, and they went into the cockpit and they sat down in the captain's chair and they began to fly the plane. And the daughter took the seat first in the captain's chair, and she was very careful not to touch any of the controls, even though Yaroslav was kind of encouraging her, to take the wheel and really see what it feels like. But she was nervous, and so she really didn't touch anything. But then Yaroslav's son, when he sat down in the captain's chair, he did grab the controls and he pulled on the wheel hard enough that he somehow disengaged the autopilot feature. and nobody noticed. And so as Yaroslav's son is yanking forward and backwards on the yoke, so the steering wheel of the plane began going in all these crazy directions because there was no autopilot to stop it. And by the time he had figured out what was wrong, it was too late because the plane had entered into an unrecoverable stall and it crashed into the foothills of Siberia, killing all 75 people on board. At the end of December in 1984, in a little village in northern India, a young woman named Sumitra had her first child with her husband. And right away, Sumitra fell in love with her little baby boy. She had always wanted a baby, and now that she had one, she carried him with her everywhere, strapped to her chest. And any time she had a free hand from cooking or housework, she would use it to pat his head or tickle his feet. Life was not easy for anyone in Sumitra's village, which was located just south of the Himalayan mountains along the Ganges River. Sumitra's village was very poor. People lived in mud huts with thatched roofs, they had no electricity, and basically no one had any formal education. As for Sumitra, her life was especially challenging even relative to her peers, because when she was very young, her mother died, and then her father had to go away all the time for work, and so she was left alone a lot and basically was raised by a cousin. And now, even though she was married, her husband also had to travel quite a bit for work. And so Sumitra, she lived with her husband's parents in their hut, but the reality is she wasn't nearly as close with them as she was with her own family, and her own family was nowhere nearby, and so Sumitra's life was really quite lonely, even as an adult. And so when Sumitra had her baby, it was like for the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone, and she was excited about her life. She was happy that something was finally going the way she wanted it to. But then, one day in early 1985, everything changed. That day, Sumitra, with her son attached to her chest, was walking into town to get water from the well. And as she was walking along the dirt path, she suddenly came to a stop, very rigid, and she dropped her bucket on the ground. A couple of other villagers who were nearby heard the bucket fall. They turned and looked at Sumitra, who was standing there totally rigid. And so one of these villagers, who was very concerned, walked over to Sumitra and asked her what was going on. But Sumitra, she didn't say anything. She just stood there frozen. And this concerned villager looked down at Sumitra's hands, and her fingers were bending back so hard it almost looked like they might break going in the other direction. And then this villager, before asking any more questions, looked up at Sumitra's face, and her eyes had rolled back into the back of her skull, and she had begun grinding her teeth so hard that it was making this loud cracking sound with every movement of her jaw side to side. And so this villager was totally terrified and backed up for a second, and right as they did, Sumitra's baby, who was still strapped to Sumitra's chest, began hysterically crying. And so the combination of Sumitra's baby crying and these other couple of villagers who were staring at Sumitra, who's standing there in this very grotesque pose, attracted the eyes of other nearby villagers. And soon there was a crowd of people just standing there looking at Sumitra, not sure what to do. And then, just as suddenly as Sumitra had fallen into this trance, it stopped, and Sumitra, she kind of shook her head, she fluttered her eyes, and she looked around, and then suddenly became aware that her son is hysterically crying, and also there's this crowd of people all around her. She has no idea why, and so feeling really embarrassed, but again, not knowing what's going on, Sumitra quickly picked up her water bucket, she held her son and hustled out of the crowd of people and made her way into town where she would get water. When Sumitra came back from the well and was back near her hut, she didn't tell anyone about what had happened on the way to the well. Frankly, she couldn't really remember what happened. And so Sumitra told herself that whatever happened on the trail to the well, that trance she fell into, it had to be a one-time thing, likely brought on by stress and sleeplessness from having a new baby. But a few weeks later, it happened again, and this time the trance lasted quite a bit longer. Sumitra's father-in-law had walked into their kitchen and found Sumitra standing there totally rigid with her hands kind of bending backwards and her eyes rolled back in her skull, and he would tell her later on that he had shaken her and tried to wake her up, but he couldn't for almost 10 minutes, and then when she had snapped out of it, she had no memory and had no idea what happened. By May of 1985, so roughly 5 months after her first trance, Sumitra was falling into these bizarre spells nearly every day, and they were lasting hours at a time. And even more bizarre, lately, during Sumitra's trances, she would begin to speak, and the things she said were totally strange. Typically, she would bark out cries for help. She would say her head was being crushed and someone needed to help her. And then suddenly her voice would drop down to a whisper, and she would say, "All I can see is darkness." Sumitra's family would contact the local medicine man who would come out and examine Sumitra, but he couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. Besides her trances, there seemed to be absolutely nothing wrong with her. She was the picture of good health. And then on July 16th, 1985, so roughly 6 months into these trances, Sumitra would fall into another trance while she was cooking, and during this trance, she would speak. Except when she spoke, she was very calm, and she just said, "In 3 days, I'm going to die." By this point, Sumitra was terrified of whatever was happening to her, and she was totally exhausted, and so was her family. Sumitra had stopped caring for her son, who was now about 8 months old, because she was afraid that at any moment she could fall into a trance and accidentally hurt him. And so her mother-in-law had basically become the boy's mother, and also Sumitra's husband, who was the primary breadwinner for the family, was forced to stop traveling for work and just stay home and help out with Sumitra and his son. Finally, on July 19th, 1985, so this was the day that in her trance, Sumitra had predicted she would die. On that day, Sumitra woke up and made a very conscious effort not to do anything that could potentially harm her. She didn't cook because she didn't want to be near flames. She didn't walk near anything with any sort of ledge she could fall off. She didn't even walk downstairs for the same reason. She also kept a very safe distance from her son in order to make sure he was safe. And by late afternoon that day, Sumitra was just fine, and there was no sign that anything bad was going to happen to her, and so she and her family began to relax. As Sumitra's mother-in-law began making dinner, Sumitra decided to go outside and get some fresh air. And when she got out there, she saw one of her close friends across the road, and so she waved to her. And as her friend cheerfully began walking closer to Sumitra to say hello, Sumitra suddenly froze, her eyes went back in her skull, her hands became rigid, and she fell into one of her trances. And so this friend, like everyone else in the village, had become quite accustomed to seeing Sumitra in these trances. And so really, the friend was not that concerned when she saw Sumitra doing this. But then Sumitra began doing something in her trance that this friend had never seen before. Sumitra, who normally had her hands by her side during these trances, she began raising her hands up till they reached her forehead, and then wildly Sumitra began clawing at something right above her head, and as she did, her breathing became very loud and labored, and so this friend, feeling suddenly so concerned for Sumitra, rushed over, but when she got right next to Sumitra, there was nothing she could do. Sumitra was just clawing at the sky, breathing really heavily, and then suddenly Sumitra stopped, and she put her hands down by her side, and she went back to this rigid pose, and then out of Sumitra's mouth came this horrible, low, rattling moan sound. It was just a constant sound that came out of her, and it got deeper and deeper and deeper until Sumitra's voice kind of cracked. And then suddenly Sumitra went totally still. And when this happened, Sumitra's friend, who was right next to her, realized Sumitra, even though she was standing upright, she was not breathing at all. It was like she was a statue. And so this friend began screaming for help. And so Sumitra's in-laws and her husband and other villagers who heard this cry, they came running outside and they quickly circled around Sumitra. And then a few minutes later, the medicine man arrived. He broke through the circle, went right up to Sumitra and began checking her out. He checked her pulse, he checked her heartbeat, he kind of looked inside of her mouth, he looked in her eyes, and then after a minute, he stepped back and he just said, "She's dead." Sumitra's husband fell to his knees, and Sumitra's mother-in-law, who was carrying Sumitra's son, began crying. All the while, Sumitra's body still remained totally upright and rigid in the middle of all these people, with her hands tight by her side and her eyes rolled back, and her face frozen in what looked like a silent scream. Eventually, the medicine man and Sumitra's father-in-law stepped forward and lowered Sumitra's frozen, rigid body onto the ground on her back, and they closed her eyes. There was no hospital to take Sumitra's body to or official to call about her death. And in this village at this time, it was very important for both religious and public health reasons to take care of the body very quickly. And what that looked like was the villagers would work together to perform the Hindu death rituals, and then afterwards they would cremate the body, which is a process of burning the body until all you have left is the ashes. And so as Sumitra's body lay still rigid on her back right near her home, her family and the villagers began making preparations for her funeral. Sumitra's mother-in-law and some women from the village began scrubbing down Sumitra's body, as well as putting essential oils on her face, and other villagers who were not a part of that went off to find wood for a fire. The villagers weren't talking much, and a lot of the women were crying, but it wasn't just grief they were feeling, it was also fear. They all knew about Sumitra's trances. They happened all the time for months. But what the villagers couldn't wrap their heads around was the idea that during one of these trances, Sumitra had accurately predicted her own death. And so now the villagers couldn't help but think that dark forces were at play here, that maybe Sumitra was possessed, and now whatever had possessed her and killed her is somewhere in the village. And so that night, as the sun started to go down, normally kids would be out playing in the village, but their parents said, no, come inside, it's not safe outside. And so for the most part, the only people who were outside that night were the women who were still cleaning and prepping Sumitra's body for her funeral. And at some point, one of the women who was doing this was brushing out Sumitra's hair. And as she did that, she suddenly stopped and she backed up and screamed and pointed at Sumitra. And then the other women all around Sumitra's body, they looked over at what this person was pointing at, and they too saw it and screamed, and everyone began scrambling to try to get away from Sumitra as fast as possible. What all these terrified women were seeing was that Sumitra, her eyes were closed, but her eyes were darting left and right, so her eyelids were kind of fluttering. And then suddenly Sumitra's chest filled with air, and then she breathed out a long, loud exhale, and then she opened her eyes and she sat bolt upright and began looking around. And the other women who were terrified, they're looking at her and they were struck by how completely healthy and normal Sumitra now looked, even though for the past 45 minutes, she didn't have a heartbeat and was totally pale and looked completely dead. Sumitra wiped the essential oils from her face, and then she stood up, and as she did, the medicine man, he had heard all the commotion and ran over, and he ran to Sumitra and kind of assisted her and got her to stand on her feet because she was a little bit wobbly. And then the medicine man performed a checkup on Sumitra, checking her heartbeat, her pulse, he looked in her mouth, he looked at her eyes, and then he asked Sumitra, how are you feeling? And Sumitra said, I'm okay. And then the medicine man, he kind of turned to face this now huge crowd of onlooking villagers, and the medicine man had a big smile on his face, and he said, you all have just witnessed a miracle. Sumitra is back from the dead. Sumitra's husband and her in-laws were too shocked to say anything or really even react. But then suddenly, Sumitra's husband was overcome with joy and he ran forward to hug Sumitra. But as Sumitra turned and saw him coming towards her, she backed up suddenly and put her hands out to protect herself from her husband. And immediately the medicine man, he kind of stepped in between the husband and Sumitra, and he patted the husband on the shoulder and said, she's been through something very traumatic. You need to give her time and space to recover. And everybody in the village who saw this happen, they were accustomed to whenever Sumitra fell into one of her trances, when she came out of them, she oftentimes was a little bit confused. And so they all just kind of assumed that this is what was happening, but on a bigger scale. This is a really intense trance they've seen, but she's just confused. She'll be okay soon. And so the villagers dispersed, and the medicine man assisted Sumitra back into her hut, and he got her in her bed where she fell asleep. And then afterwards, the medicine man reassured Sumitra's husband and her in-laws that Sumitra, when she woke up, she'd likely be just fine, but he would come by and he would do another thorough medical exam on her just to make sure. And the next morning, when Sumitra woke up, she did seem a lot better. When she left her bedroom, she seemed far less confused than she had been the night before. But But as soon as Sumitra saw her husband and her in-laws, she got so scared she just bolted from her hut and started running away. And so the medicine man who had just come by to do his thorough checkup, he saw her take off, and so he began chasing her, as well as Sumitra's husband and father-in-law. They took off after Sumitra. And finally, when Sumitra's husband caught up to Sumitra, he grabbed her by the arm to stop her, and Sumitra ripped her arm away from him, and she said, "How dare you touch another man's wife?" And as the husband kind of ushered Sumitra back towards their house, she continued to say, "You're not my family. This is not my home." And then finally, Sumitra's husband and the medicine man had to literally drag Sumitra to get her to go back inside the hut. And as they dragged her inside, she kept screaming that her name was Shiva Duetti and her in-laws had killed her. Over the next couple of days, the medicine man and Sumitra's family tried everything they could to try to snap her out of what seemed like a really long trance, but nothing they did worked. It seemed like Sumitra had just kind of lost her mind. Sumitra began refusing to touch her beloved son, and instead would demand that someone bring her Rinku and Tinku, but when no one knew who or what she was talking about, Sumitra would just get furious. Sumitra had never gone to school, and so did not know how to write, but now suddenly in this new trance that she was in, Sumitra would go inside of her bedroom and write these long, totally unhinged sounding letters to total strangers, asking them to come, please take her home. And when she wasn't doing that, she was typically outside in the courtyard looking at a scar on her foot, wondering how she got it. Sumitra also began wrapping her sari, which is a type of dress fabric, in a new and strange way around her head. She also refused to eat off of any dishes that her family had previously used, and her voice began to sound different. It was higher pitched and much faster, and the way she spoke was always so rude. And so eventually, Sumitra's husband and her in-laws and everybody in the village just kind of resigned themselves to the fact that when Sumitra had not had a heartbeat for 45 minutes when she died, during that time, she likely suffered serious brain damage, or at a minimum, when she kind of came back from the dead, she suffered some kind of psychological break. And so that was why she was acting the way she was. And soon, people just stopped trying to break Sumitra out of this trance she was in, and instead, they all focused on just trying to keep her from running away or hurting herself. And then one day, on October 20th, 1985, so 3 months after Sumitra had died for 45 minutes, Sumitra's family heard a knock on their front door. When Sumitra's husband went to the door and opened it up, he saw there was this older gentleman standing there wearing a suit and nice shoes, standing several feet back from the door, as if he was kind of shy but felt compelled to knock on the door. Now, right off the bat, this man looked totally out of place to Sumitra's husband. Nobody in this village wore suits or nice shoes. In fact, most people, including Sumitra and her family, didn't even wear shoes. But even stranger than what this man was wearing was what he was clutching against his chest. He had this huge leather-bound book with gold trim around the edges that he was holding onto very tightly as if it was very important. And so finally, this strange man, who was visibly nervous and rocking back and forth, began to speak. But his voice was so low, Sumitra's husband had to lean forward just to hear him. The man said his name was Ram Tripathi, and he wanted to know if there was a young woman living in this home who had recently begun acting differently. Sumitra's husband had no idea who Ram Tripathi was. He didn't know this guy. He certainly didn't know where he came from. But what was going through his head was, how is this stranger who's dressed in a funny way, who's got this weird book, how is he aware of the issues my wife is having? And so after a long pause, Sumitra's husband just kind of looks Ram Tripathi up and down a couple of times and then says, "Wait right here, I'll be right back." And then Sumitra's husband turned around, he walked through the hut into Sumitra's bedroom, and kind of matter-of-factly, he said to Sumitra, who was sitting there writing another letter, that there's a strange man outside named Ram Tripathi, and he's asking about you. Sumitra's husband expected Sumitra to just turn and look at him with a blank stare, like she had been doing the last few days. But this time she turned and looked up at him with a huge smile on her face, and then she leapt up and ran to the front door and leapt into the arms of Ram Tripathi. And Ram Tripathi, he was kind of taken aback, still holding his book, not really reacting to what Sumitra was doing. And at some point, Sumitra leans in and whispers something into Ram Tripathi's ear, and Ram Tripathi, he reacted to it very negatively. He kind of looked up at her and looked over at Sumitra's husband like something was wrong, but Sumitra's husband couldn't tell what Sumitra had said, and so the whole situation made no sense to Sumitra's husband, and apparently it also made no sense to Ram Tripathi. And so pretty quickly, Ram Tripathi kind of pushed Sumitra off of him and took a few steps back and looked at Sumitra and said, "What's your name?" And Sumitra is now looking at Ram Tripathi with a look of anger and betrayal on her face, and she says, "My name is Shiva Dwivedi." Ram Tripathi, after hearing this, did not respond, and instead just kind of gestured over to a low wall just outside of their house for he and Sumitra to go sit down on. And so he walked over, and Sumitra followed him, they sat down, and Sumitra's husband, he walked over, but he stayed a couple of feet back standing up. And once Ram Tripathi was sitting down, he lowered his big leather-bound book and he opened it up, and inside were all these photographs. And right away, Ram Tripathi pointed at one of the pictures, which contained a bunch of people in it, and he turned to Sumitra and he said, "Can you identify who's in this photo?" And Sumitra, she looked at the photo and immediately began rattling off names that were all correct. These are people that Sumitra's husband, he's looked over, and he's got no idea who the people are in that photo. And so after Sumitra correctly identifies that photo, Ram Tripathi turns the page, he picks out another photo, and he says, "Can you identify who's in this photo?" And again, Sumitra, one by one, would name correctly all the people in the photo. And then finally, Ram Tripathi took a sigh, and he flipped the page one more time, and he pointed to one particular picture which contained one person. And he looked at Sumitra and he said, "Do you know who this is?" And Sumitra, she would look over at the photo, and instead of immediately saying the name, she paused, and she kind of began to breathe heavy, and she seemed kind of angry, and then she looked at Ram Tripathi, and she said, "I know who that is. That's my sister-in-law, and she killed me by hitting me over the head with a brick." And at this, Ram Tripathi dropped his book on the ground, and he turned and embraced Sumitra as hard and as intensely as she had when she had run out and leapt into his arms. And he and Sumitra, they hugged and cried for a long time. And then finally, when they separated, Ram Tripathi turned to Sumitra's husband, who's still just standing there totally bewildered, and he tells him, "Let's go inside and I'll explain everything." Once Ram Tripathi was inside with Sumitra and her family, he told them an unbelievable story about a woman named Shiva Dwivedi. Shiva Dwivedi was, of course, the name that Sumitra for months had been saying was her own. But over those few months, her family had just assumed that that name meant nothing and that what she was saying was nonsense because of her brain injury. But Ram Tripathi would tell them that Shiva Dwivedi was the name of a young woman who lived in a city none of them had ever heard before, located about 60 miles away from their village. He would tell them that Shiva was a very wealthy woman who was college educated, and she had 2 young sons. And it would turn out that Shiva's youngest child was born almost on the same day that Sumitra's child was born in December of 1984. But unlike Sumitra, who after the birth of her child felt like her life got so much better, she loved her family, she was excited about the future, for Shiva, it was the opposite. When her first child arrived, it was like her life got worse and worse and worse. Shiva's in-laws had grown to hate her. They didn't like that she was so well educated, and they hated the family she came from. And so by early 1985, when by this point Sumitra was regularly falling into those trances with her eyes rolling back and her teeth gnashing, the tension and fighting in Shiva's home, 60 miles away, was reaching an almost unbearable level. Shiva began writing these long letters that she would send to her family far away, where she would detail waking up almost every night with nightmares, screaming. And in May of 1985, which is when Sumitra began speaking during her trances, Shiva got into the biggest fight she had ever gotten into with her in-laws about attending a family wedding. And on the night of May 18th, 1985, Shiva's neighbors in her city saw Shiva's in-laws literally carrying Shiva's body, which appeared to be unconscious, as they walked along the railroad tracks. When these neighbors ran up and asked if everything was okay with Shiva, Shiva's in-laws just said, oh, she's sick and we're taking her to the hospital. Now, it was nighttime, there were no lights around, and so it was really dark, and these neighbors couldn't get a good look at Shiva to see, what was going on with her. And so even though they thought this was very strange, they decided not to say anything. The next morning, Shiva's dead body was found lying on the train tracks right near the train station. And so someone raised the alarm, and before long, Shiva's uncle and sister ran to the train station, and when they got there and saw Shiva on the tracks, they also saw Shiva's in-laws were already there. And when they spoke to Shiva's in-laws, they told the uncle and the sister that it looks like Shiva must have jumped in front of a train to commit suicide. But the uncle and sister are looking down at Shiva's body, and there appeared to be really no markings, bruises, cuts of any kind on her body that you would expect from getting hit by a train, except Shiva did have a very big mark on her head. Later on, the uncle and sister would say it looked like something had bashed Shiva's head in. Shiva's in-laws would immediately cremate Shiva's body before Shiva's actual family could stop them, and the police in this area were not good at investigating crime. So when Shiva's in-laws went to them and said, yep, she jumped in front of a train, she committed suicide, but we don't have a body because we already cremated her, the police just accepted it. Shiva's father was convinced that Shiva had been murdered, but he didn't have a way to prove it. Until Sumitra appeared to die on July 19th, 1985, and then came back to life, claiming to be Shiva. Shiva's father had heard a rumor about some girl in a village 60 miles away claiming to be his dead daughter. Now, at first, Shiva's father did not believe this, but eventually he decided he would go to the village and test this girl to see if maybe it was true. And so on October 20th, 1985, Shiva's father put on his best suit and his nicest shoes. He brought his leather-bound photo book and he headed to Sumitra's village and knocked on her hut. Ram Tripathi was Shiva's dad. When Sumitra at first ran outside and leapt onto Ram Tripathi and hugged him and then whispered something into his ear that Sumitra's husband saw happening but couldn't hear what she said, and then Ram Tripathi, when he heard what she whispered, he kind of recoiled and acted angry for a second, what Sumitra was saying was, Papa. In the moment, Ram Tripathi, who was not convinced Sumitra was his daughter, felt like this is a horrible, elaborate hoax and it needs to stop. But then Sumitra correctly identified 15 people in his leather-bound photo album, including the sister-in-law who she said killed her. And even more convincing than that was that Sumitra knew how Shiva had been killed, by getting smashed over the head with a brick. This was a question that Ram Tripathi had never heard the answer to before. And at that point, Ram Tripathi believed that this must be his daughter's reincarnated spirit inside of Sumitra. And so that was when he dropped the book and gave her a big hug. This story is considered to be one of the most credible reincarnation stories ever recorded. Scientists from the University of Virginia in America actually went to India to study Sumitra and interview everybody involved. And they concluded that this was not a hoax. They said that Sumitra had most likely either been possessed by or reincarnated as Shiva Dueti. The change in Sumitra's voice that her family noticed was the same accent that Shiva had. It was very urban and educated. The strange new way that Sumitra wrapped her sari on her head was the same way that Shiva did. Sumitra was rude to her family and refused to eat off the same dishes as them because she believed she was actually a very wealthy woman who was for some reason being forced to live in this poor person's hut. And when Sumitra asked for Tinku and Rinku, those were nicknames that Shiva had given her two sons. And all those seemingly unhinged letters that Sumitra had written and fired off to random strangers were in fact sent to various members of Shiva's family. After Shiva's father, Ram Tripathi, brought Sumitra's story to the police would actually investigate this case and they would charge some members of Shiva's family. But ultimately, Sumitra's testimony was deemed unacceptable for court, and so the case was never officially solved. As for Shiva's in-laws, they have always denied killing her. Sumitra lived the entire rest of her life as Shiva, and Shiva's real parents accepted her as their daughter. Sumitra also came to accept her son and raised her son with her husband in their little village until she died in 1998. On the morning of April 30th, 1943, a fisherman named Jose Antonio Rey Maria rowed his little boat out into the rough waters of the Atlantic Ocean just off the coast of Spain. Jose was a sardine spotter, which meant his job was to go out into the ocean and look down and try to find schools of sardines swimming about 20 feet below the surface, and then he would flag the other fishermen over who would scoop the fish up with their nets. And Jose was very good at his job. In fact, he was quite possibly the best sardine spotter in the whole village of Punta Umbria, which is a small fishing village in southwestern Spain where Jose was from. But on this particular day, the weather wasn't quite great, the water was kind of murky and choppy, and so Jose wasn't seeing any sardines. But as Jose was starting to feel frustrated, he looked out, and on the surface of the water, pretty far away from him, he saw this strange object floating on the surface. And at first, he assumed it had to be maybe some dead sea animal that had floated to the surface. But as he stared at it from his boat that was rocking in the water, he saw between waves, there was a yellow color on this lump that just looked kind of unnatural. And so feeling curious about whatever this was, Jose decided to start rowing over in that direction and get a better look. And as he got closer and closer, he realized that yellow color was unnatural. The yellow was part of a life jacket, which meant this was a person floating in the ocean. And so Jose, with his heart now racing, was thinking, oh my gosh, I have to go save this person. And so he raced over right up alongside them, and as soon as he looked down, he realized it was obviously too late. This person was obviously deceased. It was a man who had a military trench coat on who was lying face down in the water. And so Jose reached into the water and rolled the guy over, and immediately he was hit with this horrible smell, and then he looked at the face of this dead person and he was horrified. The guy's eyes were sunken into his skull, he had mold growing on his chin, bones were exposed, and it almost looked like the dead guy's face was trapped in this kind of ghastly expression, as if the last thing he experienced was horrifying before he died. And then Jose noticed there was something else about this corpse. There was a chain wrapped around his wrist, and that chain extended deep into the water. And so Jose grabbed the chain and began reeling it back in, and eventually he pulled out this big black briefcase that had a code on the top of it that you would need to enter in order to open it. Now, for context, at this time in Europe, World War II was raging from Britain to Russia, and so there were literally thousands of dead corpses scattered all over the world, basically, around the areas where fighting was taking place. So, at this time, finding a dead soldier floating out in the middle of the ocean was actually not that uncommon. But in Spain, where Jose was, this was uncommon because Spain had not entered World War II. They were a neutral country. And so because there was no fighting happening there should not have been any dead soldiers floating just off their coastline. And so Jose stared transfixed at this dead soldier in his briefcase for a couple more moments, and then he kind of broke out of it and turned and yelled to the other fishermen who were out there in another boat and tried to flag them over to help get this corpse out of the water. But the other fishermen, when they realized what Jose was asking them to do, they said, no, we're not helping you with that. We're not touching the dead body. And so Jose just grabbed the dead body with one arm, and then awkwardly with his other arm, he managed to row this boat and drag along this corpse all the way back to the beach. And as he did, he and the other fishermen were kind of yelling back and forth at each other. It was kind of a commotion on the water. And so by the time Jose had got the corpse back to shore and dragged it up onto the sand, villagers in Punta Umbria had heard the commotion and come outside to see what was going on. And they saw Jose standing there with this dead body. And so they began forming a crowd around the body. And so nearby, Spanish soldiers were doing a training exercise, and they saw this crowd gathering on the beach, and so a group of them walked over to see what was going on, and they pushed through the crowd, and they saw this dead body on the ground, and right away they began searching the dead body to figure out who it was. And when the Spanish soldiers found his identification papers, they learned that his name was William Martin, and he was a major in the British Royal Marines. Also on these papers, it said that Major Martin was assigned to the Combined Operation Headquarters in London, which the Spanish soldiers knew was an outpost that organized commando raids on Nazi-held territory. Under Major Martin's military trench coat, when the soldiers opened it up, they saw he was dressed in full kit, full battle gear, which suggested he had died during one of these commando raids. But after the Spanish soldiers had removed his gear, they couldn't find any shrapnel wounds or gunshot wounds. And so the running theory was, he must have been flying over this area and maybe his plane was shot down. And that's why we can't figure out how he died. But the Spanish soldiers had not heard any reports of a plane being shot down right off the coast. And so really they had no idea how Major Martin actually came to be here. Then one of the Spanish soldiers who was still searching Major Martin's pockets found in one of them some crumpled papers and a photograph. And after he looked at them, he tapped on his commanding officer's shoulder and showed him. The photo was black and white, and it was this pretty young woman, and on the back of it, it was signed Pam. As for the crumpled papers that had been near this photo, they were bills. One was from a London nightclub from 3 nights earlier, and the other was a receipt for a diamond engagement ring. Now, these Spanish soldiers were not overly emotional, but they couldn't help but think how kind of sad it was that, Major Martin obviously was in love with this woman Pam, and they must have just gotten engaged, and now he's dead. It's like a tragic love story. And so the soldier who had found these bills and this photo folded them back up and tucked them back inside of Major Martin's pockets, and then the soldiers talked about what they should do next. Now, technically, because Spain was a neutral country, what they were supposed to do was turn this body back over to the British because he was a British soldier. But the Spanish government was run by a fascist dictator, Francisco Franco, who was not really neutral at all. He was actually secretly aligned with the Nazis. In fact, the Nazis' leader, Adolf Hitler, had helped Franco come to power, and so now that he was in power, he regularly shared secrets with the Germans. And so when these Spanish soldiers eventually contacted their higher-ups to ask what to do with this dead British soldier, their superiors told them, do not give Major Martin's body back to the British. Instead, bring his body to a nearby morgue where agents who worked for Franco would be able to inspect the body and open up that briefcase and see what was inside. And so these Spanish soldiers did as they were told. And when Franco's agents were able to finally pop open that black briefcase that was connected to Major Martin's wrist, they discovered inside 3 letters from leaders of the British military. And when Franco's agents read these letters, they knew right away they had discovered something incredible. And within days, these letters were sitting right on Adolf Hitler's desk. Now, at this time, in April of 1943, Hitler was starting to worry that he was about to lose the war. Even though the Nazis had successfully conquered most of Europe, it felt like the tide was turning against them. And in Hitler's mind, it was starting to seem likely that the Americans and the British were poised to launch some sort of massive attack on Nazi-controlled territory, and if they weren't ready for it, this could cost them the war. But Hitler had no idea where this major Allied attack was going to happen. And so trying to figure that out was basically the biggest priority the Nazis had at the time. Now, most of Hitler's intelligence suggested that this big major Allied attack was going to take place on Sicily, which is an Italian island. Italy was allied with the Nazis, and Nazi spies who were monitoring British and American phone conversations were hearing lots of chatter about an invasion of Sicily, and so that's why they believed that's got to be the place. That's where the attack's going to happen. But when Hitler looked at these 3 letters that were found inside of Major Martin's briefcase, everything changed. The letters, which were all signed by top leaders of the British military, said that the plans to attack Sicily were actually fake, that British and American forces were talking on these obviously tapped phone lines. They knew the Nazis were listening. They were talking on these lines about this invasion of Sicily just to confuse the Nazis. They wanted the Nazis to think that Sicily is the place. But as these letters would go on to explain, the real place, the real location of this huge Allied attack was going to be Nazi-controlled Greece, so 500 miles away. And so as Hitler is reading this, he's terrified because in his mind, he always thought Greece was really the Nazis' weakest link. And so to get this intelligence, it was the equivalent of like winning the lottery. Suddenly, Hitler went from having no idea where this huge attack on him was going to be to knowing exactly where it was going to be and knowing that he would have the time to shore up his weakest link, Greece. And so, on May 12th, 1943, less than 2 weeks after Jose the sardine spotter found Major Martin's body floating off the coast of Punta Umbria, Hitler sent a military directive to all of his leaders to prepare for a huge Allied attack, not on Sicily, but on Greece. And before long, German tanks were rumbling from southern France to Greece, and tens of thousands of German soldiers were setting up barriers on Greek beaches to repel the invasion. And then out at sea, the famous German U-boats, their submarines, which were so deadly during World War II, were out all over the place, getting ready to shoot any Allied ships that came towards the shore. In short, the Nazis were ready. But by July 9th, so 2 months later, nothing had happened. There had been no major Allied attack on Greece, on Sicily, or anywhere else for that matter. Meanwhile, back in Sicily on July 9th, one of the few soldiers who was still stationed there, because remember, all those soldiers had been pushed to Greece, one of the few remaining soldiers was in his bunk writing a letter to his mother, and he would detail that it just felt too quiet in Sicily. And after he had written this letter, signed it, and put it away, he heard outside a massive booming sound. And so he ran outside and he looked in horror towards the horizon. Now, instead of being a beautiful, clear blue, it was black with smoke and warships as far as the eye could see. He couldn't even count the number of warships on the horizon. And they were all coming right towards Sicily, firing their cannons and guns. This was the big Allied attack. It was on Sicily. The few soldiers in Sicily who came out of their bunkers and looked out and saw this knew right away that they were so ridiculously outnumbered that there was absolutely no hope. And so the soldier who had just written to his mother about how calm it seemed here, along with several others who was standing near him, they immediately just took off their uniforms and ran. And soon the other soldiers on the island began coming out of their cover and seeing they were under attack, and most of them did the same thing. Everybody basically ran away. And so the British and the Americans that were coming on warships barely had to fight. They took over Sicily incredibly easily, and within a few weeks, the Allies had complete control over the island, and the Italian government had been overthrown. Hitler had thought this secret intelligence he had found inside of Major Martin's briefcase would help him win the war. But in reality, those letters actually proved to be the beginning of the end for the Nazis. It would turn out Major William Martin, the dead British soldier that Jose the sardine spotter found off the coast of Punta Umbria, Spain, was not really who he appeared to be. In reality, Major William Martin didn't exist. The body definitely existed. That was a real dead body, but the identification of the body was fake. It had been fabricated by two very smart British intelligence officers named Ewan Montague and Charles Chumley as part of their very famous operation called Operation Mincemeat. And this operation was truly one of a kind. It was designed entirely to trick Hitler. The Allies knew if they dropped a dead British soldier off the coast of Spain, a neutral country, that they would turn it over to the Germans. And that's exactly what happened. And so everything that was on the fake Major's body, from the trench coat to the kit he was wearing to the identification papers, the receipts, the photos, all of it was placed very intentionally to convince the Germans that Major Martin was real. Major Martin was given a high enough military rank that it kind of made sense that he might be carrying this really special briefcase with highly classified military secrets, but his rank was not high enough that he would be known in military circles, because that would make it too easy for the Germans to identify that this was fake. And for the same reason, Montague and Chumley gave their fake major a very common name, Bill Martin. There were loads of Martins in the British military at the time, making a fake one hard to spot. But the British intelligence officers knew that they couldn't just present this kind of basic, generic British soldier and trick the entire German military. They needed to give him a backstory. And so Cholmondeley and Montagu spent as much time on Major Martin's uniform and what he was wearing as they did on his fake love affair with Pam. Montagu and Cholmondeley had a woman on their staff write these phony love letters to Major Martin, pretending to be Pam, and she wrote in beautiful curling penmanship, talking about how difficult it was to be in love with him during a war. And then also Cholmondeley and Montagu got that receipt for the diamond engagement ring, along with the nightclub receipt from just a couple of days earlier, and they tucked that into his pocket, really making it feel like this tragic love story. And so it was a combination of all of these details that had been thought through so carefully by these intelligence officers that really made Major Martin seem 100% real. As for the real identification of the dead body, it belonged to a 34-year-old homeless man from London named Glendore Michael. Michael had lived this wretched, miserable life and then eventually died when he ate rat poison that was on a piece of bread. We don't know if he tried to kill himself or if it was accidental. Michael's body had been stored in a refrigerator in a morgue unclaimed for months when Montagu and Cholmondeley found out about him and decided he would be perfect because no one would notice if his body went missing. And so ultimately, Operation Mincemeat was a massive success. Hitler completely mistook a homeless man from London for a relatively high-ranking British military officer carrying international secrets on his wrist, and it cost Hitler the war. Glendore Michael may have lived a wretched life and died in absolute agony, but in death, he helped defeat the Nazis. Today, there is a marker on Glendore Michael's grave in Spain that actually denotes him as an official British military officer. As for Montagu and Cholmondeley, they were quickly promoted after Operation Mincemeat and then ultimately became famous for their plot. In the early evening of January 23rd, 1897, a blacksmith named Erasmus Shue stoked his fire inside of his little shop in rural West Virginia and then called out to his 11-year-old helper who was in the back cleaning up. Erasmus had been planning to head home early that night. However, a last-minute order for horseshoes had just come in, and so Erasmus knew that was not going to happen. He was going to have to work late. And so he was calling for his helper to send the helper to his home, Erasmus's home, to check on Erasmus's wife, Zona. He wanted to make sure that, one, Zona knew he would be late, and two, if Zona needed anything, the helper could go out and get it for her or help around the house or whatever she needed. After the helper had left, Erasmus went back to poking at his fire, but his mind was not on the horseshoes he needed to make. Instead, it was on his wife, Zona. The couple hadn't told anyone yet, but Zona was pregnant. Erasmus and Zona had only just met a couple of months earlier, but they had fallen in love very quickly. Zona was 23 years old, and she had beautiful dark hair and dark eyes and a quick sense of humor. She was a total free spirit who had grown up on a farm, and she had never really been away from home. When Erasmus had arrived in the little village called Livesey's Mill, which was located near a river at the foot of this mountain and was right near where Zona lived, he and Zona had noticed each other right away. Erasmus, who was quite a bit older than Zona, he was 35 years old, was tall and handsome with piercing blue eyes, and he had come to this little rural town to set up his blacksmith shop. And to Zona, he was like this amazing, new, exciting thing. Zona's family, especially her mother, Mary Jane, did not approve of the fact that Zona and Erasmus had begun seeing each other, mostly because Mary Jane didn't like the fact that Erasmus was so much older than Zona. But Zona was known for being incredibly stubborn, and she loved Erasmus, and so there was just no stopping her. So, in November, just a couple of months after meeting each other, Zona and Erasmus got married and they moved into a little house together, and very quickly, Zona got pregnant. And both she and Erasmus were so excited about this that they wanted to go around and tell people, but early on, it was clear Zona had some complications with this pregnancy. She was sick all the time, and she just seemed really unwell, and the doctor who was seeing her knew that it likely had to do with her pregnancy. And so the couple decided that they should just wait and let the pregnancy develop a bit before announcing the news. So, on this late January day, Erasmus began hustling to finish these horseshoes because he really wanted to get home and be there for Zona and make sure she really was okay. And so as Erasmus thought about Zona, the steel he was heating inside of this fire was glowing bright orange and was ready to be forged into shape. And so Erasmus got his hammer and he got to work. Meanwhile, Erasmus's 11-year-old helper had arrived at Erasmus and Zona's house, and the helper walked through the gate up to the front door of this little 2-story home, and he knocked on the front door. But Zona did not come to the door, which the helper thought was odd, because Zona was someone who was always bustling around the home and was very quick to open the door and chat with neighbors. And now, standing in front of this door, the helper couldn't even hear a sound inside of the house. It was like no one was home. And so the helper knocked again, and after some more silence, he just reached down and tried the doorknob and found it was unlocked, and so he swung the door in. And right away, the helper noticed that the house was totally dark. None of the lamps were lit, even though the sun was setting fast. And so the helper stepped inside of the house and continued to call out for Mrs. Shu, but there was no answer. And at some point, as the helper turned a corner and looked towards the base of the stairs that led up to the second level, he froze. Because lying on the ground was Zona. She was lying perpendicular to how the stairs run, on her back with one arm over her chest, like she was sleeping at the foot of the stairs. And so at this point, the helper is scared. He doesn't know what's going on here. Obviously something is wrong. And so very slowly, the helper began moving closer and closer to Zona. And when he was practically right on top of her, he yelled out her name one more time. And when she didn't call back and her chest wasn't moving and she was just totally still, he knew, obviously, something was terribly wrong. And so the helper at this point turned around and sprinted out of the house and ran back to his own house. And when he got there, he ran inside and he told his mother that he thought Mrs. Shu, Zona, was dead. And so the mother told the helper, run back to the blacksmith shop and tell Erasmus to go home right now. I'll get the doctor. It would take the local doctor, the same one who had been treating Zona for her pregnancy complications, almost an hour to finally get to Zona's house. And when the doctor arrived, he found the 11-year-old helper and his mother and other neighbors kind of clustered around in the first floor of the home. And then when he went up to the second floor into the master bedroom, he found Erasmus, who by this point had returned, and he was sitting on his bed, and he had laid out his wife, Zona, so that she was on her back and her head was in his arms, and he was stroking her hair and rocking back and forth and crying. The doctor, of course, knew Zona and Erasmus very well because of how often he had been treating Zona for her pregnancy issues over these last few weeks, and so he felt a pit of sadness looking at this scene, but he knew he had to do his job, and so he gently walked over and he put his hand on Erasmus's shoulder, and he just said, I need to examine Zona's body. And Erasmus, at this point, he didn't even look up. He just continued to sob and rock back and forth while stroking her hair. Finally, the doctor kind of was a bit more forceful in asking Erasmus to step aside, at which point Erasmus did. He got out of the way and positioned Zona flat on the bed, and he made sure her hair was perfectly combed all around her neck. And then Erasmus knelt down right next to the bed and continued stroking his wife's hair and crying, while the doctor at this point kind of moved to the foot of the bed and began looking at Zona and beginning his examination. And the doctor would quickly confirm that, yes, Zona was dead. And after looking at her pelvis and kind of moving her around, the doctor came to the conclusion that very likely Zona had passed away from pregnancy complications. Zona's funeral would be held the next day at the local cemetery at the top of this hilltop. And by this point, the word had gotten out that Zona had been pregnant when she died. And so during this funeral, everybody was staring at Erasmus, who was overcome with grief and crying so hard that he could barely catch his breath. And then right before they lowered Zona's casket into the ground, Erasmus made a point of putting his wife's favorite scarf into the coffin with her. He said his final goodbyes, he shut the casket, and then it was lowered into the ground. But while the mourners were obviously very moved by just how unbelievably grief-stricken Erasmus was, his whole family was wiped out in one blow, what really stood out to the people that attended that funeral was not Erasmus's reaction to his wife's death, but rather Zona's mother's reaction to Erasmus. During this funeral, Mary Jane, Zona's mother, didn't seem sad or grief-stricken or in any way reacting to the fact that her daughter had died. Instead, as the funeral went on, Mary Jane shamelessly glared at Erasmus with a look of pure hate and disgust on her face. And then, after the funeral was over, all the mourners wanted to go up to Mary Jane and Erasmus to pay their final respects to the family, but Mary Jane ignored all these people and promptly left the funeral without saying a word to anyone. And in the days that followed Zona's funeral, Mary Jane's behavior only continued to get more and more bizarre. When neighbors would drop by Mary Jane's house to drop off food or just check in on her, Mary Jane refused to come to the door. Mary Jane basically began staying up all night. People would see there were candles lit in her bedroom at all hours, and they'd see her pacing around her room and then periodically kneeling on the ground and kind of staring off into the distance. And then on the rare occasion that Mary Jane actually left her house, she would look totally disheveled and distracted, and as she walked around town, she'd be mumbling under her breath and constantly looking over her shoulder like she was scared someone was following her. And when concerned neighbors came up to Mary when she was out of her house, she refused to make eye contact with them, didn't want to talk to them, and as fast as she could would get away from them. Whatever was going on with Mary Jane, her husband was not willing to talk about it to other people in town. However, they did notice that he had begun sleeping in the barn, so he was not even staying in the house with his wife. And then, on the morning of February 21st, so about a month after Zona had died, Mary Jane walked out of her house looking totally clean-cut. She was not disheveled. She was not looking over her shoulder. She wasn't muttering to herself. She was standing tall, moving with a purpose, looking totally coherent. And as she moved, the only emotion people could see on her face was anger. And so Mary Jane, angrily, walking with a purpose, walked her way to the local prosecutor's office, and instead of knocking and waiting to be let inside, she just opened the door and barged right inside. The prosecutor knew Mary Jane and knew how strange she had been acting over these last few weeks, and so when she came inside, he was alarmed at her sudden presence, but he was also pretty curious as to what was going on. And so when she came in and demanded to speak to him, he was happy to go into his office and take a meeting kind of simply out of curiosity. But once the two of them sat down in his office, Mary Jane proceeded to tell this prosecutor this totally outlandish story about her dead daughter, Zona, that at first made the prosecutor think, okay, clearly Mary Jane has lost her mind. That's what's been going on over the past few weeks. All this grief of losing her daughter has caused her to kind of snap. But by the end of these 2 hours that Mary Jane seemed to just be kind of rambling about this story about her daughter, the prosecutor started to realize that what she was saying kind of made a lot of sense, and his suspicions began to rise and rise. And so once Mary Jane was done telling this wild story about Zona, the prosecutor was convinced that what Mary Jane was saying had to be true, and so he knew they needed to dig Zona up. And so after Mary Jane had left, the prosecutor ran to the local doctor's house, the same doctor who had been treating Zona and then also looked at her after she died. And the prosecutor would tell the doctor that, hey, we need to exhume Zona and you need to examine her again. And the doctor at first was like, wait a minute, what's going on here? But then after hearing what the prosecutor had to say about this crazy story that Mary Jane had just told him, the doctor agreed that, okay, yeah, we do need to do this. And so the next day, February 22nd, a team of men with shovels, along with the prosecutor and the doctor, headed up to the Hilltop Cemetery where Zona was buried, and they dug her casket up, and then they carried the casket down to the local schoolhouse, and then once she was inside, the workers lifted her body, which was fairly well preserved because the ground was so cold. They lifted her body out and they placed it on a table, and then everybody left except for the doctor and the prosecutor. And once the room was clear, the doctor and the prosecutor began examining Zona all over again. And within about 30 seconds of this re-examination of Zona's body, basically at the exact same time, the doctor and the prosecutor, who were on either sides of the body, saw the thing that Mary Jane had alluded to in her wild story about her daughter. And so the doctor and the prosecutor, they're seeing this thing, they look up at each other and they can't believe it. Mary Jane's story had to be true. The following is Mary Jane's wild story. On the day of Zona's funeral, even though Mary Jane was overcome with grief over losing her daughter. The feeling that she really was harboring was hatred towards Erasmus. She hated Erasmus. She had always hated him. But now it was like her daughter is dead and she's forced to watch this guy sob and cry over her daughter's casket, when in her mind, she's like, this funeral is about her. It's not about you. And so the whole funeral, she's just staring at Erasmus, channeling all of her energy towards hating him. But then, as she's doing this, a new emotion began to creep up on her that she couldn't quite describe. Basically, it felt like something was terribly wrong. And intuitively, Mary Jane felt like the only person who could explain what this thing was that was wrong kind of in her life somewhere was her daughter, Zona, who was obviously dead. And so this feeling that something is terribly wrong, it completely consumed Mary Jane's mind. And so by the end of the funeral, she wasn't mad at Erasmus. She was just thinking, how do I get in touch with my daughter? I need to get answers from my daughter. And so when the funeral ended, Mary Jane just left the funeral as fast as she could. She went home, she went into her bedroom, and she knelt down and she began to pray. Not for peace or strength in this difficult time, but instead, she prayed for her daughter's ghost to appear to her and tell her what was wrong. And for the next month, that is all Mary Jane did. She was obsessed with this idea that she needed to basically conjure her daughter's ghost to tell her what this thing was that was wrong. And so that was why she was acting totally crazy. All she did was pray and then look for signs that her daughter's ghost had come or was on her way. And so she'd be up all night kind of looking around, hoping her daughter would suddenly appear. And then when she would go outside, the reason she was muttering is because she was still praying under her breath. And she was always looking over her shoulders because she thought her daughter would appear any moment. And then finally, one night in the middle of February, so this is a month into Mary Jane's attempts to conjure her daughter's ghost, she was in her room, she was praying like she normally did with all of her candles lit, and all of a sudden, as she's kneeling down praying, this bright light appears in the middle of her room. And as this light suddenly appeared, the room began to get really cold. And Mary Jane is staring at this light thinking, this is my daughter. But then just as quickly as the light and the cold that came with it had appeared, it disappeared. And so Mary Jane was both really excited because she felt like, okay, the prayers are working. That had to be my daughter's ghost or some sign that my daughter's ghost is going to come here. And so Mary Jane just doubled down on her prayers. She knew she was close to getting her daughter to show up. And so over the next 2 days, that bright light would appear 2 more times, and each time it would just quickly disappear. But again, Mary Jane is thinking, okay, something's happening. My prayers are working. And then finally, on the 4th night, as Mary Jane is in her bedroom praying, the light appears in the middle of her room. It starts to get cold. But then instead of the light disappearing, Mary Jane would describe seeing her daughter kind of step out of this light and suddenly appear in the room. Mary Jane said that her daughter was dressed all in black and her skin was very pale and her eyes were these dark pits and her hair was straight down right over her shoulders, and she was staring at her mother. And Mary Jane, when she saw this, even though she had been trying for a month to get her daughter's ghost to appear, now that it seemed to be happening, she was terrified. And so Mary Jane began backing up right as this ghost begins walking towards Mary Jane. But then Mary Jane, as she's up against the wall, tells herself, you have to be strong. You need to talk to the ghost. You need to figure out what's wrong. And the only question that Mary Jane was able to come up with was, how did you die? And when she asked this question, Zona's ghost came to a stop. And then when Zona opened her mouth, dirt poured out. And then with a raspy, low voice, she began to tell her mother a story. She told her that Erasmus appeared to be this wonderful person to the community, but behind closed doors, he was a monster. He hit her and screamed at her over the littlest things. And then on the night of January 22nd, so one day before Zona would be discovered at the base of the stairs by Erasmus's helper, Zona's ghost would tell Mary Jane that Erasmus had become enraged at Zona over the food she had made that night for dinner. He had wanted meat and she had made something else. And so he was furious. And when Zona tried to tell Erasmus that she would make more food, or there was other food for him to eat, to just please calm down. Erasmus stood up and he grabbed Zona by the neck and he lifted her off the ground. And right at this moment in this story that Zona's ghost is telling Mary Jane, the ghost would stop speaking, and this look of abject terror would come across the ghost's face, as if she was suddenly reliving this moment that happened with Erasmus. And as she's standing there with this horrible look on her face, the ghost began to levitate off the ground, and then it opened its mouth. And as it did, no sound came out, but instead, it was like all the air in the room was getting sucked into this ghost's open mouth. And then all of a sudden, there was this loud cracking sound as the ghost's head suddenly violently whipped around 180 degrees, but the ghost's body was still facing towards Mary Jane. And after this happened, Mary Jane is sitting there totally dumbstruck, and the ghost suddenly drops back down onto the ground, still with their chest facing Mary Jane, but their face pointing behind them. And then Zona's ghost turned around and began walking out of the room, and because she had turned her body around, that meant her head, which was facing the wrong way, was now oriented towards Mary Jane again, and Mary Jane would say the ghost was smiling, and then right before Zona's ghost left, she would say to her mother, "Now do you see what he did to me?" And then Zona just vanished, and the room became warm again, and Mary Jane, who was suddenly feeling so exhausted, just sat down on the bed and wept. Mary Jane had, the next morning, promptly gotten up and rushed to the prosecutor's office and told him the story of seeing her daughter's ghost and how the ghost had told her that Erasmus had throttled her, and that was what killed her. Now, the prosecutor was really moved by Mary Jane's story, but it was when he rushed to the doctor to ask about re-examining Zona's body to see if she had marks on her neck from where she could have been throttled. That was when the doctor actually told the prosecutor that when he did the examination of Zona's body on the day she was found, he would say that Erasmus spent the entire examination at the head of the bed, cradling Zona's head and brushing her hair. But now that he was thinking about it, he could have been covering up her neck with the hair. And then also they thought about the funeral when, right before Zona was lowered into the ground, Erasmus placed a scarf claiming it was his wife's favorite around her neck when she was buried. Again, perhaps trying to conceal the fact that there were marks on her neck. And when they did exhume Zona's body and they removed that scarf that Erasmus had placed, they would see there were marks all over her neck that looked like fingerprints. And then upon further examination, they would see that her neck was actually dislocated and that her windpipe had been crushed. Erasmus would be arrested for the murder of his wife just minutes after the doctor and prosecutor, basically at the same time, saw the marks on Zona's neck during their re-examination. During Erasmus's trial, Mary Jane would take the stand and she would tell the story of her daughter's ghost coming to her and explaining that Erasmus had killed her. And the testimony was so compelling that the jury found Erasmus guilty, even though there was no motive. Basically, they convicted him on the strength of Mary Jane's ghost story. Erasmus would be sentenced to life in prison, but he would die just 3 years after being incarcerated from a mystery illness that passed through the prison. It would also turn out that Erasmus had been married 2 times before marrying Zona. One of his wives had divorced him for being abusive. The other wife died in a freak accident when she was helping Erasmus fix their chimney when all of a sudden a brick fell loose and hit her in the head. Today, there is a plaque right near the cemetery in West Virginia where Zona was buried that reads in part, "Only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer." On the evening of June 17th, 2004, a 21-year-old woman named Molly Daniels pulled into the driveway of her little home that she shared with her husband and 2 kids in suburban Texas. It had been a long day for Molly at the home remodeling business where she worked as a receptionist, and so now that she was home, the last thing she wanted to do was go inside and make dinner for her family. And so, after turning off her car, Molly just sat there in the driveway for a couple of minutes, just zoned out looking out the window. But eventually, she kind of snapped out of it, she gathered up her things, she got out of the car, and she made her way up to the front door. And as soon as she stepped into her home, that bad mood she was feeling from work was wiped away and replaced with happiness. Because the first thing she heard the second she was in her home was the sound of her 4-year-old son, Caleb, hysterically laughing. And so Molly walked into the back room and she found her son, along with her husband, Clay, rolling around on the ground, tickling each other. And next to them was their 1-year-old daughter sitting on the rug, laughing as well and clapping and watching along. And so as soon as Molly walked into the room, Clay, who was underneath Caleb, stopped for a second and grinned up at Molly. Molly smiled back, and then Clay and Caleb went back to wrestling, and the 1-year-old continued to laugh and play along. And so Molly suddenly felt so content with her life. It was so incredible to have a family of her own. And so, with a big smile on her face now, she headed off into the kitchen to make dinner. Life had been tough financially for the Daniels family recently. The city where they lived, called Leander, was located just north of Austin, Texas, and it was getting more and more expensive every single year. Clay, who was 2 years older than Molly, he was 23, he was a mechanic, but he had been out of work for months, and so he had just been staying home with the kids. As for Molly, she had her job as a receptionist, but it paid very little, and so ultimately the family was just barely scraping by. But despite the financial hardship they were under, Molly was so thankful that she had a husband in Clay that was so good with their kids, especially Caleb, the 4-year-old son, because Caleb was actually Molly's son from a previous relationship, and she was worried that maybe Clay wouldn't necessarily treat him like his own, but Clay had totally stepped up to the plate and become Caleb's father, and Caleb definitely viewed Clay as his dad, and so that relationship was as close as if they were biologically related, and so Molly just felt so grateful for that. That evening, the family sat down and had dinner together, and then afterwards, Molly and Clay got the kids off to bed, and then Molly and Clay stayed up and watched TV together. But after a while, Molly said she was tired and she was going to go to bed. Clay said he'd be staying up for a bit longer, and so the couple kissed, said goodnight, and Molly made her way upstairs. At around 10:45 p.m. that night, so about 15 minutes after Molly went upstairs, she was laying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when she heard the sound of their front door open and then shut, and then she heard the sound of their car being turned on and leaving the driveway. Now, this was not a big deal for Molly because earlier that night, Clay had mentioned kind of offhandedly that he wanted to go see his mom that night, that he might swing over there and say hello. He had a couple of paperback books that he wanted to give her. And so Molly knew there was a chance he could be doing that. And so she assumed that had to be what she was hearing. And so she forgot about it and fell asleep. The next morning, when Molly woke up at 6 a.m., she rolled over and she saw Clay was not in bed with her. Now, she wasn't immediately alarmed by this because it wasn't unusual for Clay to get up really early. And so Molly climbed out of bed, she made her way over to the window, and she looked down at the driveway, expecting to see their car back, meaning Clay would be downstairs somewhere. But she looked in the driveway, there was no car. And so suddenly feeling kind of panicked, Molly went downstairs and looked around the house. Clay wasn't there. And so she picked up the phone and she called Clay's mother. And when Clay's mother picked up, Molly said, "Hey, is Clay with you? He said he was stopping by last night. I heard him leave. Is he with you?" And Clay's mother would say, "No, he's not here. And in fact, I didn't even know he was going to be stopping by last night. I haven't heard from him." The drive from Molly and Clay's house to Clay's mother's house was 40 miles of twisting, fairly dangerous highway. Now, Clay regularly made this trip to and from his mother's house, and so Molly was never that worried about him going on this 40-mile stretch. But suddenly, without saying it, both Molly and Clay's mother were thinking the same thing. Did Clay get into a car accident last night on the drive to his mother's house? And so at some point, Clay's mom on the phone tells Molly to stay calm, stay at the house with your kids. I'm going to get in the car. I'm going to drive the route that Clay would have taken back to you, and we'll see if we can find him. And then as soon as the two women hung up, Clay's mother ran to her car. She jumped inside. She turned it on. She peeled out of the driveway and began speeding those 40 miles back towards Clay and Molly's house. And she had only gotten about halfway along this trip when up ahead she saw all these flashing blue and white lights. She saw crime scene tape across the whole road. This was a section of the highway that was heavily forested on either side, and she could see traffic was backed up very far on the other end and as well on her side. And so of course Clay's mother is thinking, this is my son. He's been in an accident right here. And so she pulls over to the side of the road. She throws it in park. She gets out and runs to the nearest police officer and begins frantically asking them, what's happened here? What's happened? And as she's talking to the officer, she notices behind him, there's all this smoke coming up from the forest. There's a fire down in the forest. And so she's craning her neck to look down and see what it is. And the officer tried to stop her, but finally she pushed past him and she looked and she saw there was a car on fire that clearly had flown off the road. And so in a total panic, she begins asking the officer, do you know who it is? Is it my son? Is it Clay? The officer told her to please calm down. We have no idea whose car this is. We're trying to figure it out. The fire department hasn't even put the fire out yet. We don't know enough to tell you anything. But at this point, Clay's mother could not wait any longer for answers. And so she turned around, she ran back to her car, she hopped in it, and she made her way around this big police barricade and sped the rest of the way to Clay and Molly's house. And there, she picked up Molly, she drove her back, and when they got there, both women are totally hysterical, but they run right up to the police tape, and they look down in the direction of where this fire had been, which now had been put out. There was just smoke coming off of this car frame that had been totally burned out. And immediately, when Molly looked down there, she recognized the car. Or I should say, she recognized the shape of the car, because the fire had totally eviscerated the car. But Molly, she was seeing the frame was about the right size, and she was seeing that strewn around this burned out car were all these paperback books that had been burned up partially in this fire. And she knew that Clay had likely been on his way to his mother's house with all these paperback books inside of the vehicle. And so she knew this had to be Clay. And at the same time that Molly is having this horrible realization, the fire department down below was able to actually get into the burned out vehicle. They opened up the door and they found right away there was a body in the driver's seat. And so between the size of the body, all the paperback books that Molly said, that would be something Clay would have, along with several other personal effects that were found inside of the car, like Clay's prized Harley-Davidson pin that he always wore in his hat, it was obvious that this was Clay. When word spread about Clay's death, Molly's neighbors and friends in Leander jumped into action. People loved Molly in Leander. She was this very sweet, very kind woman who was a little bit socially awkward, but they had found ever since she had married Clay, she had really found some more confidence and just seemed happier. And so it was totally devastating to see Clay be pulled from her life like that. And so very quickly, the community in Leander raised $1,000 and they gave it to Molly and her kids. And then also neighbors began dropping off food and stocking their fridge with groceries. And even though Molly couldn't even eat, she was so grief-stricken from the loss of Clay, she still very much appreciated the effort that people were making to comfort her. But as the community rallied around Molly and her kids to get them through this difficult time, the police were starting to ask some questions about how exactly this crash that had killed Clay actually happened. Because there were some oddities about the scene of the accident. The biggest being, there were no skid marks on the road, which meant Clay had not hit the brakes before swerving off the road and crashing down in the trees below. And secondly, they didn't really understand how the fire that had started after this crash had gotten so incredibly hot that it basically had completely melted away every part of the vehicle save for the frame. And also Clay's body had been totally destroyed. I mean, the authorities had seen fires after car accidents, but nothing like this. This looked very unique. And so investigators started to wonder if they were really dealing with a car accident or if this was a murder. And on June 22nd, just 4 days after Clay was found, investigators would learn from the crime lab that their suspicions had been correct. It would turn out there was lighter fluid found all over the front seat of the car, so that was the reason the fire had gotten so big. And then during the autopsy, Clay's lungs showed that he had not ever inhaled any soot, meaning he was dead when the fire started. And so very likely, Clay was murdered and the car accident was staged. And interestingly, when word started to get out in town that Clay's death seemed suspicious and that maybe he was murdered, it turned out nobody was surprised. Because even though Molly adored Clay and thought he was a great father, most other people in Leander hated him. He was known around town to be this totally short-tempered guy who would just pick fights with people out of the blue. In fact, at Clay's own funeral, his literal best friend stood up to eulogize him, and during this, he said, "I think honestly, the world is a better place without Clay." And so investigators began looking into Clay's background to see if they could find connections with people that might have a grudge or some reason to be mad at Clay who might want to do him harm. And very quickly, investigators found something. Just 10 days before Clay was found, he had pleaded guilty to sexually assaulting a 7-year-old girl. But the sentence he received was incredibly light. He was given 30 days in jail, which he had not served yet, and probation. Now, the father of the victim, the 7-year-old girl, was absolutely furious about Clay's light sentence. And in fact, just a couple of days before Clay died, the father threatened to kill Clay. So investigators quickly tracked down this father, and then they brought him in for questioning. But very quickly, this father made it clear to police that yes, he hated Clay. Yes, he had threatened to kill Clay, but no, he had nothing to do with what happened to Clay. And the father had an alibi to back that up. And so after confirming his alibi, the police somewhat reluctantly allowed the father to leave, even though to a lot of them, he just really seemed like the slam dunk primary suspect, but he couldn't have been. And so with him out of the picture, the police were kind of back to the drawing board. And so they decided they would actually go talk to Molly and see if maybe she could shed some light on who else might have wanted to hurt Clay. Now, in their previous conversations with Molly, police found her to be incredibly polite and also at the same time very, very upset about the death of her husband. But this time, when investigators showed up at Molly's house and she brought them into her kitchen where they sat down to talk, it was like the police got a totally different Molly. And it happened as soon as they asked her, hey, who do you think could have hurt your husband? It was like Molly suddenly became impatient. She didn't have time for these questions. And finally, she just said, you know what? I think Clay was depressed because he had that prison sentence that was coming up that he didn't want to serve. And so probably he just killed himself. I think that's what happened. And so now I need you guys to leave. And so the officers didn't make a fuss. They didn't fight Molly on this. They just got up, they left. But once they were back out in their car, they looked at each other and they both agreed that Molly's behavior was very suspicious, and it made them think, maybe she actually knows more about what happened to Clay and she's kind of trying to cover it up and make the police go away. And over the next couple of weeks, as police began investigating Molly, they discovered quite a bit of evidence that made them even more suspicious of her. For one thing, there was Clay's $110,000 life insurance policy that Molly was entitled to, and Molly had apparently been calling the insurance company nearly nonstop every day, trying to get them to wire that payment as soon as possible. And Molly apparently was telling people in town how excited she was about getting that money. Also, police learned, after talking to Molly's neighbors, that Molly was starting to date again already, just 3 weeks after her husband has died. She's out there on the dating scene, even bringing home one of her boyfriends and having him live with her 2 kids. And according to Molly's babysitter, this new boyfriend that was coming into the house was really upsetting Caleb, the 4-year-old, who had been so close with Clay. The babysitter would say that Caleb, who normally was a very mellow child back when Clay was still alive, was now very violent and emotional, and periodically he would just stop, look up into the sky, and scream, "I love you, Daddy!" But when the babysitter brought this up to Molly and said, really, you should get your son some help here, Molly got angry and said Caleb was fine, it was none of her business, and then she slammed the door on the babysitter. But despite how suspicious Molly now seemed, there wasn't any real evidence that actually linked her to Clay's death. And so finally, in the fall of 2004, so several months after Clay's death, and still the police have not figured out who killed him or how he died and how he wound up in this inferno by the side of the road, they decided to kind of reinvigorate this investigation into Molly. They really wanted to find evidence that she was involved in Clay's death. And so they decided to put a surveillance team on Molly 24/7. And at first, the undercover police would report that Molly's behavior was incredibly routine. She basically did the same things every single day. She got up, she got the kids out the door, she went to work. Afterwards, she picked her kids up from the babysitter, she went home, she fed her kids, and then they all went to bed, and they did it all again the next day. The only deviation from her schedule was periodically she would go out after work to run some errands, like go to the grocery store. But then on December 3rd, so 6 months after Clay was found, Molly would finally break her routine. On that day, Molly, on her way home from work, made a pit stop in this parking lot near several local stores. So she parked her car, she got out, but then instead of walking into one of these stores to run an errand or something, she walked to a dark-colored Mustang that was parked in the parking lot as well, and a guy was driving it. This guy the cop didn't recognize with dark hair. Molly walked up to him and began talking to this guy through the window, and then at some point, Molly began very suspiciously looking over her shoulder like she was trying to see if anyone was watching her, and then she walked around and climbed into the Mustang with this guy. She shut the door, and then the two of them drove off together. And so the undercover police officer followed after them. And eventually, the Mustang containing Molly and this guy pulled into the parking lot of a Taco Bell, a fast food restaurant. And so they stopped, they got out, and the undercover officer watched as the two of them casually walked inside of the Taco Bell. They ordered some food, and they sat down by the window to eat. And so by this point, the undercover officer, he's not seen anything incriminating happening here, but what he's seeing is such a break from her routine that it just seemed really suspicious, and he wanted to go inside and have a look. And so he called for backup from another undercover officer who was part of the surveillance team. He came into the parking lot, and then the two of them, these two officers who are wearing plain civilian clothes, they both got out of their unmarked vehicles, and they casually walked into the Taco Bell, and they got in line to order food. And as they were standing in line, one of the undercover officers casually turned around in line and very nonchalantly scanned the room, like he was looking at nothing in particular. But in reality, what he was doing was taking a quick glimpse at Molly and this guy she was with. And when the officer took this quick glimpse, he noticed something very strange about the guy that Molly was sitting with. Something that the officer hadn't seen before, but now that he was up close, he could see it. And as soon as he saw this strange thing, the officer tapped on his partner's shoulder like, all right, we're doing something here. The officer reached down, put his hand on his concealed gun underneath his shirt, and then he walked across the restaurant, not even pretending to be undercover at this point. He's basically giving away that he's a cop. He strode right over to their table, and when he stopped in front of them, Molly and the guy she was with both looked up at him in surprise, and the officer just stared down at the guy. Not at Molly, just at the guy. The strange thing the officer had caught when he looked over at the guy was that he recognized him. This was someone he knew personally from being in law enforcement in the area. This guy was Clay Daniels, Molly's supposedly dead husband. He had just clearly dyed his blonde hair black. It would turn out Molly and Clay had staged his death in order to keep him from having to serve that prison sentence for the sexual assault charge, and so they could collect on the $110,000 life insurance policy. The body that was found inside of the burned out car was obviously not Clay's. It was the body of an 81-year-old woman who Clay had dug up from some isolated cemetery, thrown inside of his vehicle, and then pushed his vehicle off the road and lit on fire with lighter fluid. And so that was why there was no skid marks up on the road, because again, this was not a car accident, it was staged. And so after Clay and Molly staged Clay's death, it actually worked. People really believed that Clay had died. They were questioning how he died, but nobody really thought it wasn't Clay. And so their plan was working. But after 3 weeks of being apart, with Clay kind of hanging out by himself away from the town, Clay and Molly just couldn't stand to be apart any longer. And so Clay dyed his blonde hair black. That was the only thing he did to disguise his identity. And then he just moved back into the home with Molly and the kids. And so that was the new boyfriend that neighbors were seeing Molly with. She was not actually going out on new dates. She was just back with Clay. And Clay's stepson, Caleb, the 4-year-old, he immediately recognized that his father was back, even though he had black hair. But Molly and Clay had convinced the little boy that Clay was not really Clay. Instead, this was the new boyfriend, Jake. This is very likely why Caleb had begun acting out. He was old enough to understand that something wasn't right, but not old enough to understand that his parents were lying to him. It's unclear why Molly and Clay, who lived together shamelessly, decided to have this weird rendezvous in the parking lot inside of Clay's Mustang and then go to Taco Bell and eat together. But regardless, it was this secret meetup that ultimately led to them getting caught. Molly and Clay were both charged with insurance fraud, and they both pled guilty. Molly was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and Clay was sentenced to 30 years in prison, plus 20 more years for probation violations. Molly has since been paroled, while Clay is still in jail. On the afternoon of June 6, 1980, a 56-year-old man named Zygmunt Adamski, who just went by Ziggy, was having a late lunch with his wife and his cousin inside of Ziggy's little brick house in the English village of Tingley. That day had been a particularly stressful day for Ziggy and his family because the following day was Ziggy's goddaughter's wedding, and Ziggy was very close with his goddaughter. Ziggy and his wife couldn't have kids because of medical issues, and so his goddaughter had basically become, at least in Ziggy's mind, like his own daughter. And so in fact, at her wedding, Ziggy was going to be walking her down the aisle. And while Ziggy was really excited about this, he was also very stressed out that he was going to screw it up. And so he had gone over and over, what responsibilities he had as part of the wedding party. And he had this little speech he had to give that he had rehearsed 50 times. He had it written out. I mean, he was ready, but he was very much in his own head about something potentially going wrong that he would be responsible for. And on top of that stress, Ziggy had gotten into a fight that day with his cousin because he felt like the cousin was being kind of disrespectful in some way to his goddaughter. And so Ziggy had stepped up and defended his goddaughter to his cousin. And so there was this undercurrent of tension at the lunch table, not to mention this overarching stress that Ziggy was under about this wedding. And so as Ziggy and his cousin and his wife have this kind of tense meal, Ziggy suddenly realizes that he forgot to get potatoes when he went to the store earlier to buy ingredients for this meal. And for some reason, Ziggy decides, you know what, I'm going to just put my stuff down now, go to the store, and get those potatoes, even though at this point it was too late to make the potatoes for the meal. And so maybe Ziggy just wanted to go out and do anything to get away from his cousin for a minute and away from all this wedding planning they were doing and just kind of go out and clear his head. And so Ziggy put his napkin down on the table. He stood up. He told his cousin and wife that he was going out to get potatoes. They were like, okay. And the cousin actually said, do you want me to come with you? Is there anything else you need to get while you're out? And Ziggy said, nope, I'm good. He grabbed some cash out of his wallet and he headed out the door. The village of Tingley, where Ziggy and his wife lived, was a very safe place. He and his wife had actually moved there after fleeing from Poland during World War II, where both Ziggy and his wife, whose name was Lottie, had been held prisoner at some point. And so after all this trauma of being held prisoner and having to flee their home country, they had looked for the safest, best place to kind of resettle and stay for good, and Tingley was it, and they loved it. Ziggy had gotten a job in Tingley as a coal miner, and he had been doing that for 27 years. As for Lottie, she didn't work because she had a disease called multiple sclerosis, which meant she was confined to a wheelchair. But Ziggy and Lottie had quickly made lots of friends in town who were very supportive, and so it wasn't long before Ziggy and Lottie had a very happy and stable life in this town. The little shop where Ziggy was going to was only about 3 blocks away from his house, which meant walking to the store, getting potatoes, and coming back would only take a few minutes. And so Lottie and the cousin back home, they expected to see Ziggy really come back within 10-15 minutes. But when he didn't, and after about 30 minutes went by, Lottie actually got really concerned because Ziggy was just not the type of person to do stuff unannounced. He was incredibly methodical, he was very punctual and reliable, and so being late from this little trip to the store was just so uncharacteristic that Lottie told the cousin, hey, you go to the store and see if Ziggy is there. See what's going on here. Ziggy had worked in the coal mine for nearly 30 years, and he had some serious lung issues from breathing in all of the coal, and so Lottie was thinking, maybe he collapsed or something along the way from these breathing issues. But when the cousin got to the shop owner told the cousin that they had seen Ziggy. He had come in about 25 minutes earlier, he had bought a bag of potatoes, seemed totally normal, everything was fine, and he had left, walking back in the direction of his home. And so the cousin thanked the shopkeeper and then left and began jogging back towards Ziggy's house, thinking, maybe he had just not seen him on the way, that maybe Ziggy was sitting down somewhere on this 3-block path. But the cousin got all the way home and didn't see any sign of Ziggy. And so after going back inside of the house, the cousin and Lottie talked about what they should do, and they actually went back out into the neighborhood asking around, asking neighbors and other people if they had seen Ziggy. But after a couple of hours of canvassing the neighborhood and not finding Ziggy or finding any indication of what happened to him, Lottie ended up calling the police. But the police were not inclined to launch a huge investigation for a grown man who's only been missing for a couple of hours in his neighborhood with no sign of foul play or any other sign that anything really bad had happened. And after the police began asking questions of Lottie and the neighbors about what Ziggy's life was like, they learned that recently Ziggy had been declined for an early retirement from the coal mine. Because of those breathing issues he was having, he had requested to retire now, but they said no. And so Ziggy was really upset about that. He was really stressed about this wedding of his goddaughter the next day. He had been fighting with his cousin. Also, Ziggy was basically taking care of his wife, who's in this wheelchair all the time. And so because of all these stressors in Ziggy's life, the police started to wonder if maybe it was possible that Ziggy had not been going to get potatoes, but in fact was just kind of abandoning his family. And so ultimately, on the day that Ziggy went missing, the police told Lottie and Ziggy's cousin that they should just sit tight, see if he comes back tonight, and if he doesn't, go to the wedding tomorrow, because Ziggy is so close with the goddaughter. If he's having some sort of issue right now, he's very likely to come back for something as significant as this wedding. And so Lottie and Ziggy's cousin stayed at the house all night. Ziggy did not come back. They didn't hear from him. And the next day they went to the wedding, but Ziggy didn't show up for that either, even though he's supposed to walk his goddaughter down the aisle. And so after coming back from this wedding, Lottie called the police. She called local hospitals. She talked to all of her neighbors. I mean, she really put out like an all points bulletin to everybody in the area that something terrible has happened to Ziggy and we need to find him. But despite police beginning to lean into this and her neighbors really going out in force to try to find Ziggy, no one could find him. He had just vanished. On the morning of June 11th, so 5 days after Ziggy went to get potatoes and then vanished, a man named Trevor Parker got to work at his father's coal yard in the English town of Todmorden. The coal yard was basically just this big open lot that had a chain link fence around it that butted up against some railroad tracks. And inside of this lot were just these huge mounds of coal up against the perimeter of the lot. And then also inside of the coal yard was one small office building. And so on this morning, when Trevor pulled through the gates of this coal yard, first of all, he could see the entire yard the second he went in. And as he looked out, all he noticed was the fact that everything was wet from an early morning storm. And so after just kind of surveying around the lot to make sure none of the coal got blown around from the storm, he made his way to the small office building to do some paperwork. Trevor would work inside of that office building for a while, and then around lunchtime, Trevor decided to just go and get some lunch and kind of have a nice long lunch break. And so he left, he went to the pub, he was there for a couple of hours, and then around 3:45 p.m., he came back to the coal yard, and when he went through the gates, everything looked the same, except there was this dark thing on top of one of the coal piles in the back of the yard. Now, Trevor didn't know if he had seen it when he had first arrived that morning or if it was new, but whatever it was on this pile, it immediately caught Trevor's attention. And so after parking his vehicle, Trevor began walking over to this 12-foot tall coal pile with this thing on it. And when he got about 30 feet away from it, he realized he saw someone's shoe, that this dark figure was a person. And right away, Trevor started rolling his eyes because there was a group of homeless people that lived near the railroad tracks just outside of the coal yard. And it wasn't uncommon for them to get really drunk and then wander their way into the coal yard where sometimes they would fall asleep. And so Trevor's thinking, okay, clearly one of these drunk homeless people has found their way into the coal yard and they've passed out on top of this pile of coal. And so instead of going over and talking to this person directly, Trevor just turned around, went back inside of the office building, and he called for an ambulance. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later. They did not have their sirens on. They didn't come flying into the yard. This was a routine thing they were doing. They were scooping up a drunk and bringing them back to the hospital. And so when the medics got out of their ambulance and Trevor directed them over to the proper coal pile, they were just cracking jokes along the way. This was not a big deal. When the two medics got to the bottom of the coal pile, one of them began climbing up the coal to go see this drunk person and get them down. And so Trevor, as this is happening, he walked a little bit closer, and when he did, he realized that the person who had fallen asleep on the coal, they had really nice pants on, like tailored pants. They were certainly not what Trevor expected this person to be wearing. But before Trevor could even really react to the clothes this person had on, the medic who had climbed up had finally reached this person. They reached down and began trying to move the person around. And suddenly, when they had manipulated this person's body enough, the medic's facial expression completely changed. They went from somewhat routine to totally horrified, and they backed off of this person on the coals. They turned around and ran down the coal, practically falling over themselves. And when they got down there, Trevor heard the medic say to his partner, call the police right now. And Trevor said, what's going on? What did you see? And the medic who had reacted that way just shook his head and walked away to kind of compose himself. And so Trevor at this point was starting to get spooked himself. Clearly, whatever the medic had just seen had really shaken him up. And so Trevor just kind of stood there while the other medic ran in and called police. And then a few minutes later, a police car came flying into the coal yard, and an officer named Alan Godfrey, along with his partner, got out of the car. And right away, the medic who had gone to the top of the pile and been freaked out by what he saw walked over with a very ashen face, and he told Alan Godfrey that something was terribly wrong with the person on top of this pile. And so Alan, not really sure what to expect, walked over with his partner to this coal pile, and with the medics and Trevor standing back, Alan, on his own, climbed up the coal, and he looked down at this person. And what Alan saw was a man lying on his stomach wearing a beautiful three-piece brown suit. And Alan immediately noticed that there was absolutely no soot from the coal that this guy was laying on his suit, even though Alan, just to get up here, had basically covered himself in black soot. And so he was wondering, how did this guy get up here and not get covered in soot? It didn't make any sense. Also, Alan noticed that this guy's hair looked totally bizarre. It looked like someone had given him like a really bad haircut with dull scissors. Like they just grabbed tufts of his hair and kind of chopped randomly. I mean, his hair was kind of all over the place. There were bald spots. And then as Alan looked from this guy's hair down, he noticed almost hidden in his hairline was this fairly deep wound in the back of his neck that was still bleeding. But there was this weird green jelly-like substance very obviously placed over this wound. And Alan had no idea what this substance was. But as weird as all that was, that didn't explain why the first medic had basically completely panicked and run away. When Alan tried to roll this guy over onto his back to try to wake him up and see if he was okay, He rolled him over, and Alan got a look at this guy's face. And immediately Alan let go of him and kind of had to step back for a second, because the guy's face was contorted in this frozen look of absolute terror. His jaw was open so wide, it was almost like his lower jaw was dislocated, and his teeth were baring, and his eyes were bulging out of his head. And so Alan quickly realized that obviously this was not just some drunk homeless person who passed out here. This was a dead person, and whatever happened to them must have been unbelievably terrifying to leave someone looking like that in their death pose. It would turn out this deceased man in the coal yard was Ziggy Adamski. But this did not solve the mystery of what happened to Ziggy 5 days earlier. In fact, his discovery really only created more questions. This town where this coal yard was, Todmorden, was located 25 miles away from where Ziggy lived. And as far as anyone knew, Ziggy didn't know anybody in Todmorden. So there was no reason for him to be there. And number two, when he had left to go get potatoes, he had been on foot. So did he walk 25 miles to this random town? Also, assuming he did just walk to this coal yard, this coal yard is a big, wide open lot that if you were standing anywhere near it, even outside the fence, you could look in and basically see the entire place. So it just seemed really unlikely that Ziggy could just walk into this very public open space and get to the top of one of these coal piles without somebody noticing him, whether that was Trevor or one of the other employees that were there, or one of the truck drivers that were in and out of there all the time, all day doing deliveries, or the homeless people who were near the railroad tracks, or the people who rode the trains that passed by there every single day. I mean, there are a lot of eyes on this coal yard, but nobody saw Ziggy. It was like he just kind of appeared at the top of this pile. And again, even if Ziggy had managed to slip in and sneak to the top of this pile, why didn't he have soot from the coal all over his clothes? And if maybe he had been brought there, if someone had killed him and put him on this coal pile, there's even more reason he would have soot all over him, because they would have had to drag him up to the top of the pile. And even putting all that aside, if someone really did kill Ziggy and they placed him on this pile, why? This is a very open public place. Someone is going to find him. You're going to get caught if you're the killer. And then, of course, there is the issue of what Ziggy was wearing. That brown three-piece suit he was wearing that had no soot on it, it wasn't his, and it wasn't put on right. The buttons were not lined up. It almost looked like somebody else who didn't know how to put a suit on had tried to dress Ziggy. And then Ziggy also did not have an undershirt on. It was just the jacket over his skin. And then also Ziggy had this totally bizarre haircut that looked like someone who didn't know how to give a haircut had cut his hair with scissors and said, good enough. And then, of course, you have this wound on the back of Ziggy's neck. Now, the wound itself was determined not to be fatal. It was a fairly deep cut, but it wouldn't have killed him. However, the most significant part of that wound was that green jelly that had been placed across the back of it. During Ziggy's autopsy, they were unable to figure out what this green jelly was, and they ran dozens and dozens of tests on it. And also, during the autopsy, the coroner would determine that Ziggy had actually died the same day he had been found. So he was doing something for 5 days between going missing and being on this coal pile, but nobody knows what it was. And as for his cause of death, the coroner was not entirely sure, but it did seem like he died of a heart attack. The coroner would search all of Ziggy's body for signs of some sort of fight he might have gotten into, some sort of defensive wound on his body, but there was nothing. However, the coroner did find there were very small burns on the back of his neck that were caused by acid, but it was unclear how those got there. When they inspected Ziggy's stomach, they determined that he had been eating and drinking regularly, and so he was not malnourished, he was not dehydrated. He was relatively healthy when he died. He just had this heart attack for unknown reasons, and apparently whatever gave him the heart attack scared him so badly, his face contorted in that horrible way. Ultimately, the coroner just kind of gave up and ruled that Ziggy had died of natural causes, and then the case was closed. But to this day, no one really has any idea how Ziggy went from going out to get groceries to winding up 25 miles away, dressed differently, with this haircut, with this jelly on him and acid burns, dead with this horrible look on his face on this coal pile. It doesn't make any sense. This case has become very famous because people say it is the best example of alien abduction. that Ziggy had left his house to get groceries, got abducted by aliens, and then over 5 days, these aliens did stuff to Ziggy, including cutting into his neck and dropping acid on him, and then they put that green stuff on the back of his neck. They dressed him the way they thought people dressed in the suit, but they didn't really do it right, and then they literally just dropped him on top of this coal pile, which would explain why he didn't have soot all over him. He was dead, they dropped him, and he just landed on the top of the coal pile. And even if you think that's totally far-fetched, keep in mind, still today, we do not know what that green jelly compound was on the back of his neck. It's literally never been identified, and people have been trying to figure it out for 40 plus years. Also, it's worth noting that one of the responding police officers, Alan Godfrey, claimed to have seen a UFO within weeks of finding Ziggy Adamski.